Chapter 1. The Letter That Changed Everything. The year was 283 AC, and the ashes of King's Landing still smouldered in the distance when Eddard Stark returned to River Run, carrying secrets that would reshape the fate of the Seven Kingdoms. But it was not Ned who would uncover the truth that night. It was his wife, heavy with their first child and desperate for clean linens, who would stumble upon the evidence that would change everything. Catelyn Tully Stark moved carefully through their chambers, her belly round with the child who would one day be called Robb. The war was over, they said. Robert sat the Iron Throne, the Targaryens were dead or fled, and her husband had returned from whatever dark business had taken him to Dorne. But Ned carried himself like a man haunted, and the babe he'd brought with him, this Jon Snow, was a constant reminder of betrayal that cut her to the bone. Bastard, she whispered to herself, the word bitter on her tongue. My husband's bastard. The irony was exquisite, though she would not understand it for years to come. In that moment, reaching into Ned's travel pack for a clean shirt to replace his blood-stained tunic, Catelyn Stark believed she knew the worst truth her marriage would ever hold. She was wrong. Her fingers found fabric first, a cloak, she thought, though it was heavier than any cloak should be. As she drew it from the pack, something metallic chimed within its folds, and parchment crackled. The cloak was stark grey, but it was stained with old blood that had dried to rust-brown patches. Wrapped within it was something that made her breath catch, a harp of silver, its strings dark with what could only be more blood. But it was the letter, pressed between the harp's frame and the cloak, that stopped her heart entirely. The parchment was torn, stained, and written in a hand she knew as well as her own, her good sister Lyanna's elegant script, though shaking with pain or urgency. "Promise me, Ned," the letter began, and Catelyn's hands trembled as she read words that were never meant for her eyes. "Promise me you'll keep him safe. They can never know who he truly is. Aegon Targaryen must live, but not as a Targaryen. Robert would kill him for his father's name alone. Tell him I loved him. Tell him his father was not the monster they claim. The realm will need him someday, when the long night comes again. Promise me, brother. Promise me you'll let him think himself a bastard, rather than let him die a prince." The letter slipped from Catelyn's nerveless fingers, fluttering to the floor like a dead bird. Her mind reeled, pieces of impossible truth arranging themselves into a picture she could not accept. The babe sleeping in the nursery, the child she had resented and feared and hated for the shame it brought to her marriage. "No," she breathed. "No, it cannot be." But even as denial rose in her throat, other pieces began to fit. The child's stark colouring, so like Lyanna's own. Ned's uncharacteristic secrecy about the mother. His refusal to speak of Jon's conception, even to his wife. The way he flinched whenever Robert made his crude jests about Targaryen blood. "Catelyn." She spun, the harp tumbling from her lap, as Ned stepped into their chambers. He was clean now, his hair damp from washing, but his grey eyes held that same haunted look they'd carried since his return. Those eyes fixed on the letter at her feet, and all the colour drained from his face. "Cat, I can explain." "Explain?" Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the force of thunder. She bent to retrieve the letter, her movements sharp and controlled. "Explain how you've made me hate a child who never deserved it. Explain how you've let me poison my own heart with jealousy over a lie." Ned stepped forward, hands raised, as though approaching a wounded animal. "You don't understand. Rhaegar's son." The words fell between them like a blade. "That child is Rhaegar Targaryen's son. Lyanna's son." She held up the letter, her hand shaking. Were you ever going to tell me? Or were you going to let me hate your nephew for the rest of my days?" The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sound of the trident flowing past Riverrun's walls. When Ned finally spoke, his voice was hollow with exhaustion. "Robert would kill him, Cat. You know he would. The moment he learned that Jon carried dragon blood, he would put that child to the sword without hesitation." His shoulders sagged under invisible weight. "I found Lyanna dying at the Tower of Joy. She made me promise to protect him. How could I do that if everyone knew what he was?" Catelyn stared at her husband, this man she had married for duty but grown to love, and saw him clearly for perhaps the first time. Not the honourable Ned Stark, whose rigid morality was legendary throughout the Seven Kingdoms, but a brother who had made an impossible choice to save his nephew's life. "You let me hate you," she said softly. "You let me think you'd broken your wedding vows, that you'd dishonoured our marriage. You never said a word. I kept my promise to her. That was all I could do." She looked down at the letter again, reading her good sister's words with new understanding. "Aegon Targaryen," she murmured. She named him Aegon. "But he can never be Aegon. He must be Jon Snow, Ned Stark's bastard if he's to live." Ned moved closer, his voice urgent. "Cat, you cannot tell anyone. Not your father, not your sister, not anyone. Too many people know the truth of his birth already. Howland Reed was with me at the tower. If word spreads, Robert would have him killed." She finished the thought, understanding flooding through her. The magnitude of what Ned had done, what he was asking her to do, settled over her like a shroud. "How long were you going to carry this alone?" "Forever, if I had to." Catelyn studied her husband's face, seeing the years of strain written in the lines around his eyes. He had condemned himself to a lifetime of appearing dishonourable to protect an innocent child, his sister's child, and she had made that burden heavier with her resentment and coldness. "Give me the harp," she said quietly. Ned bent to retrieve the silver instrument, its blood-stained strings catching the lamplight. As he placed it in her hands, Catelyn felt the weight of more than metal. This was Rhaegar's harp, the same one Bard sang of, the one he had played when he crowned Lyanna, his queen of love and beauty, the beginning of the war that had torn the realm apart. She loved him, Catelyn said. Not quite a question. Yes, and he loved her. Ned's voice was soft with old grief. Not the monster Robert painted him as. A man who loved music and prophecy and a northern girl with flowers in her hair. Catelyn traced one of the harp's strings with her finger, wondering what songs it had played, what love it had witnessed. Then, with sudden decision, she rose and moved to the fireplace. The letter crackled as she held it toward the flames. "Cat, what are you doing?" What should have been done years ago. The parchment caught fire, Lyanna's words disappearing in orange light. "This secret dies here, with us. No one else will ever read these words." She watched her good sister's final letter burn to ash, then turned back to Ned. The harp remained in her hands, heavy with history and hidden truth. "We'll hide this," she said, her voice steady now with purpose. "Somewhere safe, where only we will know. And we'll protect him, Ned. We'll protect Jon." She stopped, correcting herself. "We'll protect Aegon, whatever name he bears." Ned stared at her, wonder replacing the fear in his eyes. "Cat." "I've been cruel to that child. I've resented him for something that was never his fault, never even true. That ends now." She wrapped the harp back in its blood-stained cloak, holding the bundle close. "He's not your bastard. He's your nephew. Our nephew. Lyanna's son. He can never know. Not while Robert lives. maybe not ever. Then we'll raise him as Jon Snow, and we'll love him as Aegon Targaryen." Catelyn moved to her husband, placing a hand over his heart. "You've carried this burden alone for too long. Let me share it." Outside their window, the first light of dawn was touching the eastern sky. In the nursery down the hall, 2 babes slept peacefully, one destined to be Lord of Winterfell, the other hiding the blood of dragons beneath the guise of northern bastardry. Neither child knew that their lives had just changed forever, that the woman who had resented one and loved the other now held a secret that would reshape the very foundations of their world. Catelyn Stark had sought clean linens, and found a hidden prince instead. In the space of a single letter, a marriage built on duty had become a conspiracy built on love, love for family, love for truth, and love for a child whose true name would remain unspoken for years to come. The Game of Thrones had just gained a new player, and she would prove more dangerous than any of them imagined. Chapter 2. The burden of truth sleep came fitfully to Catelyn Stark in the days that followed her discovery, and when it did come, it brought visions that haunted her waking hours. She would dream of a silver-haired babe with purple eyes, reaching for her with tiny hands while she turned away in cold rejection. She would wake gasping, her hand pressed to her swollen belly where Robb grew, and remember with crystal clarity every harsh word she had spoken about Ned's bastard in the child's presence. The worst nightmare came on the 3rd night after learning the truth. In her dream, she stood in Winterfell's Godswood, watching a grown Jon Snow, no, Aegon Targaryen, place a crown of winter roses on his own head, while ghost wolves howled in the distance. When he turned to face her, his eyes were the deep purple of his true father's line, and he spoke words that chilled her to the bone. "You called me bastard, Aunt. You taught me I was nothing. How fitting that you should kneel to nothing's king." She woke with tears on her cheeks and found Ned watching her with concerned grey eyes. "The dreams?" he asked softly, and she nodded, unable to trust her voice. He had been having his own nightmares. She could see it in the way he startled awake some mornings, reaching for a sword that wasn't there. "Tell me again," she whispered. "Tell me about her. About them." It had become their ritual, these pre-dawn conversations, when the rest of Riverrun still slept. Ned would speak of Lyanna and Rhaegar in quiet tones, painting pictures of a love that had torn the realm apart, and a woman who had chosen her heart over her duty. Each telling added another piece to the puzzle Catelyn was slowly assembling, not just of Jon's parentage, but of the boy he might become. "She was fierce," Ned said, his voice soft with memory. "Fierce and beautiful and stubborn as a winter storm. Father always said she had wolf's blood. Same as Brandon. She couldn't bear injustice, couldn't stand to see the weak trampled by the strong. And Rhaegar? Not the monster Robert paints him as." Ned's jaw tightened slightly. Melancholy, some called him. Bookish. He read prophecies and histories, played his harp, and dreamed of things beyond the throne. When he looked at Lyanna, Ned paused, searching for words. "I saw them together once, before it all fell apart, at Harrenhal. The way he watched her laugh, it was like watching a man see sunlight for the first time." Catelyn absorbed this, adding it to her growing understanding of the child sleeping in the nursery. He'll have that in him, won't he? The melancholy, the books, the music. Perhaps, or perhaps he'll be all Stark, like his mother. Ned reached for her hand. "Either way, we need to be ready." Their planning had begun in earnest the morning after the revelation. They moved carefully, speaking in whispers behind closed doors, crafting the foundation of what Catelyn had come to think of as their great deception. The irony wasn't lost on her. Ned Stark, the man whose honor was spoken of from dawn to the wall, becoming a master conspirator for love of family. "The wet nurse," Catelyn said during one such session, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire in their solar. "We need a story about the mother. People will ask, and they'll remember what you tell them." Ned nodded grimly. "Willa. She was a serving woman in Starfall, where I brought Dawn after Arthur Dane's death. She helped tend my wounds. Kind enough, and far enough away that no one here would know her well enough to question details." Ned's mouth twisted with distaste at the deception, but Catelyn could see his resolve. "If anyone asks directly, I'll say the details are painful to discuss. That should discourage most inquiries. And if Robert asks, you know he will. He'll want details, crude ones." The thought of Robert Baratheon, new king, old friend, and mortal enemy to any with Targaryen blood, making his coarse jests about Ned's supposed conquest, sent a chill through both of them. Robert's hatred for Rhaegar ran deeper than the trident, and the sight of Lyanna's corpse had only fed that rage. "I'll give him enough to satisfy his curiosity and change the subject to something else. His own conquests, perhaps, or tales of battle." Ned's voice carried bitter humor. Robert has never been one to dwell on details when there are larger stories to tell. They discussed other dangers, too. Lord Tywin, whose spies were soon, those inquiries would become more pointed. Hints, she decided finally. Enough to suggest there are complications in our marriage, without specifying what kind. Let him assume it's the ordinary difficulties of newlyweds adjusting to war's end. He'll want to help. Then I'll deflect. Tell him time will heal what troubles us, that we're working through our differences. The words felt like ash in her mouth, but she pressed on. "He raised me to be useful to my husband's house. This is how I'm useful now." As the days passed, Catelyn found herself studying Jon with new eyes. The babe was barely a moon's turn old, but she could already see traces of his heritage in his features. His hair was dark like the Starks, but there was something in the shape of his face that reminded her of portraits she'd seen of Targaryen princes. His eyes, still the cloudy blue of all newborns, would they darken to grey like Lyanna's, or lighten to the purple of his true father's line? The household had begun to notice changes in her behaviour, though they interpreted them through their own understanding of recent events. When she stopped her sharp comments about the bastard and began asking pointed questions about his feeding and health, the servants attributed it to feminine weakness. Perhaps pregnancy was making her softer toward children in general. When she insisted on personally inspecting the nursery arrangements, they whispered about grief over Lyanna's death, making her protective of her good sister's memory. None suspected the truth, but Catelyn knew their attention was dangerous nonetheless. "We need to be careful," she warned Ned, after catching two kitchen maids whispering about her sudden interest in Jon's welfare. "Too much change too quickly will raise questions." "Then we make the changes gradual," Ned agreed. "You were always practical. Let them think practicality is overriding emotion, that you're ensuring the bastard is properly cared for, so he doesn't become a burden or embarrassment." The conversation that truly sealed their pact came a full week after Catelyn's discovery, during one of their midnight vigils. Jon had been restless that night, his cries echoing through the castle corridors, and Catelyn had surprised herself by rising to tend to him herself rather than letting the wet nurse handle his needs. Standing in the nursery with Rhaegar's son in her arms, feeling his small weight against her chest, something fundamental shifted inside her. This was not Ned's bastard, the symbol of his betrayal. This was Lyanna's child, her nephew by marriage, a boy whose very existence was an act of defiance against Robert's reign of terror, against Targaryen blood. When Ned found her there, still holding the now sleeping babe, she looked up with eyes bright with purpose. "I want to know everything," she said quietly, her voice fierce with determination. "Everything about the Tower of Joy, about what you saw, what she said. Every detail about Rhaegar and Lyanna's time together. Every scrap of information about what this child might become. If we're going to protect him, if we're going to raise him properly, I need to understand who he really is." Ned studied her face in the candlelight, seeing perhaps the same transformation she felt within herself. "Are you certain? Some truths, once known, cannot be forgotten." "I've already forgotten who I was before I knew this truth," Catelyn replied, adjusting the child in her arms. "The woman who resented this innocent babe is dead. What rises in her place needs to be worthy of the task ahead." And so Ned told her everything. About finding Arthur Dane and his sworn brothers guarding the tower where their prince's love lay dying. About the battle that claimed all but him and Howland Reed. About climbing those stairs to find Lyanna in a bed of blood, holding a newborn son and begging her brother to save him from Robert's wrath. He told her about burning the birthing bed, about the strange blue flowers Lyanna had scattered around the room, about the way she'd whispered Rhaegar's name with her last breath, about the horrible choice between honoring his friend and saving his nephew, and how he'd chosen family over friendship without hesitation. "Promise me," Catelyn said when he finished, echoing the words that had haunted him for weeks. "Promise me we'll never let him be less than what he is, even if he can never know what he is." "I promise," Ned replied. And in those words, Catelyn heard the birth of something new, not just a conspiracy, but a covenant. They would raise Jon Snow as carefully as any prince ever born, even if he never knew his crown was hidden beneath a bastard's name. As dawn broke over River Run's walls, two conspirators made their final vows to each other and to the sleeping child whose destiny they now shared. The Game of Thrones had gained not one new player, but two, and the hidden prince they protected would grow up surrounded by love disguised as duty, truth disguised as lies, and a mother's care disguised as practical necessity. The burden of truth would prove heavier than either of them imagined, but they would bear it together, for as long as the realm had need of hidden dragons and the wolves who guarded them. Chapter 3. Raising a Hidden Dragon. 7 years had passed since Catelyn Stark first held the terrible truth in her hands, and in that time she had learned that raising a hidden prince was an art form requiring the delicacy of a master craftsman and the ruthlessness of a seasoned politician. Jon Snow, she still thought of him by that name, even in her private moments, was 7 years old now, and every day brought new challenges to keeping his true nature concealed while ensuring he grew into the man he was born to be. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Winterfell's solar as Catelyn watched Maester Luwin conduct lessons for her children. To any observer, it was an ordinary scene. The learned Maester instructing the Stark children in history, letters, and numbers while their mother oversaw their education. What none could see was the careful orchestration behind Luwin's seemingly random choice of subjects. "Tell me, boys," Luwin was saying, his voice carrying the patient tone of a teacher who had repeated these lessons countless times. "What do you know of the Targaryen kings? Their customs, their achievements?" Robb, now 6, and every inch his father's son, with his auburn hair and blue eyes, wrinkled his nose in concentration. "They had dragons," he said confidently, "and they conquered the 7 kingdoms. Father says they ruled for 300 years. "Very good, Robb. And Jon, What can you add?" Catelyn watched her nephew. How strange that she could think of him as such now, when for so long she had forced herself to see only a bastard. As he considered the question, at 7, Jon was already showing signs of the man he might become. His hair was dark as a winter night, his grey eyes thoughtful and serious beyond his years. There was something in his bearing, a natural dignity that made even grown men listen when he spoke. "They weren't just conquerors," Jon said slowly, his young voice carrying a gravity that made Catelyn's chest tighten with pride and fear in equal measure. "Some were scholars, some were dreamers. Maester Luwin showed us the texts about Daeron the young dragon, but also about Baelor the Blessed, who tried to replace swords with prayers." "Excellent, Jon. And what does this teach us about the nature of power?" "That having it and using it wisely are different things," Jon replied without hesitation. "That a crown doesn't make a man good or evil. It just makes his nature more important." Catelyn saw Luwin's slight nod of approval and felt a quiet satisfaction. The Maester had been her willing, if unknowing, accomplice in this education. When she had suggested that the bastard boy should receive more comprehensive lessons, to prevent embarrassment to the Stark name, she had explained, Luwin had agreed readily enough. He could not know that every lesson about Targaryen history, every discussion of kingship and leadership, was carefully designed to prepare Jon for a destiny he didn't yet understand. After the lesson concluded, and the boys scattered to their various pursuits, Catelyn lingered in the solar, watching through the window as Jon made his way toward the Godswood. It had become his habit to spend time there alone, particularly after lessons that touched on dragons and kings. Sometimes she wondered what he thought about during those solitary moments beneath the heart tree. "My lady," Luwin said quietly, approaching with his usual measured gait. "A word, if I may?" Catelyn turned, keeping her expression neutral. "Of course, Maester." The boy shows remarkable aptitude for statecraft and history. His questions about Targaryen governance are sophisticated for one so young. Luwin's grey eyes held a curious gleam. "I wonder sometimes if his interest in these matters comes from some deeper source." The word sent a chill down Catelyn's spine, but she kept her voice steady. "Jon has always been precocious. Perhaps growing up as he has, neither fully family nor truly apart from it, has given him a different perspective on questions of legitimacy and power." "Perhaps." Luwin studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "In any case, he is a credit to House Stark's fostering. Lord Eddard should be proud of the boy's development." After the Maester departed, Catelyn allowed herself a moment of relief. Luwin suspected something, but not the truth. Not yet. Still, it was a reminder of how precarious their secret remained. How many eyes watched for signs of the extraordinary in the ordinary? The afternoon brought visitors to Winterfell. Lords from the surrounding holdings come to discuss harvest yields and winter preparations. Among them was Lord Reed of Greywater Watch, a small, quiet man whose green eyes seemed to see more than others. Catelyn had been cultivating this relationship carefully over the years, knowing that Howland Reed was the only other person alive who knew the full truth of Jon's heritage. During the evening feast, she maneuvered herself to sit beside him, their conversation appearing casual to any who might observe. "Your boy grows tall," Reed said quietly, his voice barely audible above the din of conversation and clinking cups. "He has his father's bearing." "Which father?" Catelyn asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Reed's smile was knowing and sad. "Both, I think. The prince's dignity, the wolf's strength. Dangerous combinations in one so young." "He dreams?" Catelyn confessed, her voice dropping even lower. Strange dreams. He tells me of flying, of cities with red walls, of a great threat coming from the north. Last week, he woke screaming about burning ships and bleeding stars. Dragon dreams, Reed confirmed, his expression growing grave. The blood shows itself in many ways. Some Targaryen saw the future in flames. Others heard whispers in the wind. If the boy is having prophetic dreams at 7, what does it mean? It means he is who we know him to be, and that hiding his nature will only grow more difficult with time. Reed paused, considering his words carefully. It also means the realm may need him sooner than we hoped. After the visitors departed, Catelyn found herself drawn to the practice yards where Jon often spent his mornings. It was well past the hour when most children would be abed, but she often found him here in the late evening, working through sword forms by moonlight with the intensity that troubled her. Tonight was no different. He was alone, as usual, moving through the basic patterns Ser Rodrik had taught all the boys. But there was something in his movements, a fluid grace that seemed beyond his years. More troubling still was the way the other boys treated him during group training, not with the casual dismissal one might expect toward a bastard, but with a cautious respect that spoke of an authority they couldn't name but instinctively recognized. "Jon," she called softly, stepping from the shadows. He turned, lowering the practice sword, and in that moment she saw it again, the way he carried himself, the natural dignity that marked him as different. In the moonlight, with his dark hair and serious grey eyes, he looked startlingly like the young Ned she had married. But there was something else there too, something that reminded her of the portraits she had seen of dragon princes. "Mother," he said, and the word still caused a small pang in her chest. He had called her that since he was old enough to speak, and she had never corrected him, even when it would have been easier to maintain the fiction of distance. "You should be sleeping," she said, but without real reproach. "Tomorrow's lessons will be here whether you're rested or not." "I couldn't sleep. The dreams again." He set down the sword and moved to sit on a nearby bench, patting the spot beside him in an unconscious gesture of familiarity that spoke to how far they had come from those early days of pretended coldness. Catelyn joined him, studying his profile in the moonlight. "Tell me." "I was flying," Jon said quietly. "Over great armies, over burning cities. There was a woman with silver hair who called my name, but not the name everyone knows. She called me." He paused, frowning with the effort of memory. "She called me brother, but that's not right, is it? Robb's my brother, and Bran when he gets older." The words struck Catelyn like a physical blow. In his dreams, Jon was meeting Daenerys Targaryen, the Dragon Queen across the narrow sea. The blood was calling to blood across thousands of miles, and somehow a 7-year-old boy was seeing glimpses of family he had never known existed. "Dreams can be strange things," she said carefully. "Sometimes they show us fears, sometimes hopes, sometimes just the shadows of stories we've heard." "This felt different," Jon insisted, "like a memory of something that hasn't happened yet." He turned to look at her directly, his grey eyes, so much like Lyanna's, holding an adult seriousness that made her heart ache. "Mother, why do I feel like I'm waiting for something? Like my real life hasn't started yet?" The question hung between them in the cool night air, heavy with implications neither could fully voice. How could she tell him that he was waiting for a crown he didn't know was his? That his real life would begin only when the secret that protected him was finally revealed? "Perhaps," she said finally, choosing her words with infinite care, "you're meant for more than Winterfell can offer. Perhaps someday you'll find your place in the world, and it will be larger than any of us can imagine." "Do you think names matter?" John asked suddenly. I mean, really matter? If someone was born to one name but lived under another, which would be their true name? Catelyn's breath caught. The question was too pointed, too specific to be mere childhood curiosity. I think, she said slowly, that names are given by others, but worth is earned by deeds. A man can honor any name if he chooses to live with honor. John nodded, seeming to accept this answer, but Catelyn could see the wheels turning behind his young eyes. He was beginning to sense the inconsistencies in his life, the careful gaps in the stories told about his origins. Soon he would start asking harder questions, and she and Ned would need to decide how much truth a boy could bear. As they sat together in comfortable silence, Catelyn reflected on the strange turn her life had taken. 7 years ago, she had been a young bride, struggling with jealousy and wounded pride. Now she was a mother to 4 children, Robb, Sansa, Arya, and the baby Bran, and secret guardian to a hidden prince who might someday rule the 7 kingdoms. The Game of Thrones continued its deadly dance around them, but here in the quiet of Winterfell's practice yard, under the light of ancient stars, Catelyn Stark allowed herself to hope that love and careful planning might be enough to guide a dragon disguised as a wolf to his destiny. The hardest trial still lay ahead, but tonight, watching Jon's peaceful face in the moonlight, she dared to believe they were building something that could endure. The hidden prince was growing into his power, whether he knew it or not, and Catelyn Stark would be there to guide each step of his journey toward a throne he had never been told was his by right. Chapter 4. The Web of Whispers. The raven that arrived at Winterfell on a cold morning in late autumn carried news that would have seemed innocuous to most who read it. A merchant in White Harbour asking questions about northern bastards. A travelling septon in Barrowton inquiring about the Tower of Joy. A minor lord's younger son showing unusual interest in the fate of Sir Arthur Dayne's sword. To Catelyn Stark, these scattered reports formed a pattern that chilled her more thoroughly than any winter wind. Someone was hunting for information about Jon Snow. She stood in her solar, the coded letter from her father's steward, trembling slightly in her hands, as the full scope of their danger crystallized before her. 7 years of careful protection, of building walls around their secret, and now those walls were being probed by invisible hands. The game of whispers she had entered as a desperate mother was about to become a war. "Ned!" she called, her voice carrying the sharp edge of urgency that had learned to recognize. "We need to speak. Now." When her husband appeared, still brushing snow from his cloak after returning from his morning ride, Catelyn handed him the letter without preamble. She watched his face grow pale as he read, saw the moment when the same realization struck him that had struck her. "How many sources?" he asked quietly. 3 separate networks, all reporting similar inquiries, all within the past fortnight. Catelyn moved to the window, looking out at the practice yard where Jon was working through sword forms with Robb and Theon Greyjoy. Even from a distance, she could see the easy authority in Jon's movements, the way the other boys deferred to his judgment during their mock combat. He was becoming harder to overlook, harder to dismiss as merely another bastard. Someone knows enough to be looking, but not enough to know what they're looking for. "Varys," Ned said, the name falling like a stone into still water, almost certainly. "But there are others." Catelyn turned from the window, her mind already working through the implications. "I've received a letter from Lysa. She mentions, almost in passing, that Lord Baelish has been asking about old friendships between great houses, particularly those formed during Robert's rebellion. He's specifically curious about which lords might harbour lingering loyalties to fallen houses." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Peter Baelish, Lord of the Fingers, Master of Coin and Lisa's childhood friend, was many things, but he was not stupid. If he was asking about loyalties to fallen houses while Varys was investigating northern bastards, the coincidence was too pointed to be accidental. "We need better intelligence," Catelyn said, her voice taking on the crisp tone she used when planning complex household logistics. The skills were surprisingly similar. Both required thinking several moves ahead, anticipating needs before they arose, and managing multiple moving parts without letting any single element fail. If they're watching us, we need to be watching them. Over the following weeks, Catelyn set about activating networks she had spent years building. The key was subtlety. She could not appear to be gathering intelligence for any specific purpose, lest she draw attention to the very secret she sought to protect. Instead, she framed her inquiries as the natural curiosity of a lord's wife concerned about her family's security in an uncertain realm. Letters went out under her seal to distant cousins, childhood friends, and the wives of lords who had served with honor during the rebellion. Each missive was carefully crafted to seem innocent while gathering specific intelligence. She asked about travelers passing through their lands, about questions being asked in their halls, about any unusual interest in events from the war years. The responses painted a troubling picture. Varys's spies were indeed active throughout the north, but their focus was oddly specific. They weren't gathering general intelligence about the great houses. They were looking for information about bastards, about women who might have borne children to lords during the war, about any unusual circumstances surrounding births in the years immediately following Robert's rebellion. Even more concerning was what her network revealed about Littlefinger's activities. The Master of Coin was using his position to investigate financial records from the war years, looking for unusual expenditures that might indicate hidden children being supported. He had also been quietly cultivating relationships with Maesters throughout the realm, trading favors for access to birth records and family genealogies. "They're hunting dragons," Catelyn explained to Ned during one of their midnight conferences. "Not us, specifically, but any dragon blood that might have survived Robert's purge. They know something lived through the slaughter, and they're casting a wide net to find it." "Why now?" Ned asked, his face haggard with worry. "Why, after 7 years of silence?" The answer came in an unexpected form, a letter from her sister that arrived by Raven just as the first snow began to fall. Lysa's correspondence was typically filled with complaints about life in the Eyrie and excessive concern for her sickly son Robert, but buried within the familiar grievances was a piece of information that made Catelyn's blood run cold. "She writes that King Robert has been having nightmares," Catelyn said, reading aloud from the letter. "Dreams of silver-haired children burning his kingdom while dragons soar overhead. Jon Arryn is concerned that the king's paranoia about Targaryen restoration is affecting his judgment. He's ordered the search for any surviving dragonspawn to be intensified." Ned's curse was quiet but heartfelt. They both understood what this meant. Robert's paranoia was driving the investigation, and his hatred for Targaryen blood ran deeper than any rational fear of political opposition. If he discovered Jon's true parentage, no amount of friendship with Ned Stark would save the boy's life. "We need contingency plans," Catelyn said, her mind already working through possibilities. "People we can trust, places Jon could go if his identity is discovered. We need to build a network that can protect him, even if we cannot." The most crucial meeting took place in the Neck, where Howland Reed maintained his floating castle amid the swamps and bogs that had swallowed whole armies throughout the centuries. Catelyn made the journey under the pretense of visiting old friends, bringing only a small escort and traveling as quickly as winter weather would allow. Reed's Hall was unlike any other in the Seven Kingdoms, a wooden structure that rose and fell with the waters, accessible only to those who knew the secret paths through the marshland. It was here, surrounded by the mists and moving waters that made the neck nearly impregnable to outsiders, that Catelyn and the only other living witness to the Tower of Joy planned for the unthinkable. "If the boy's identity is exposed," Reed said, his quiet voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "he'll need more than sanctuary. He'll need legitimacy, a cause that men can rally to." "What do you mean?" "I mean that Jon Snow, bastard of Winterfell, would be hunted to the ends of the earth and killed without ceremony. But Aegon Targaryen, rightful heir to the Iron Throne, with proof of his parentage, and supporters willing to press his claim." Reed let the implication hang in the air between them. It was treason, of course. Plotting to place a Targaryen on the Iron Throne while Robert Baratheon still lived was the highest form of treason imaginable. But as Catelyn sat in that strange floating hall, listening to the splash of water against timber and the distant cries of marsh birds, she found herself nodding. "What would we need?" "Proof first. The marriage records, if they still exist. Witnesses to the ceremony. Something more than just our word and a dying woman's letter." Reed ticked off the requirements on his fingers. "Then allies. Northern lords who remember their oaths to House Stark and might be persuaded that protecting Ned's nephew is worth the risk. Finally, somewhere to retreat to if things go badly. Somewhere Robert's armies can't reach." They spoke through the night, planning for a future neither hoped would come to pass, but both knew might be inevitable. By dawn, they had the bones of what Reed called the Northern Conspiracy, a network of loyal lords who could be approached carefully, tested for their willingness to support an alternative to Robert's rule if circumstances demanded it. Returning to Winterfell, Catelyn began the delicate work of preparing her own children for a truth they could not yet be told. She framed it as family loyalty, as the duty all Starks owed to each other, regardless of birth or station. During family dinners, she would steer conversations toward topics of honor and protection of the innocent. She told them stories of great lords who had risked everything to defend those who depended on them. "A Stark protects those who cannot protect themselves," she would say, watching as her words took root in young hearts. "Blood or not, if someone has found shelter under our roof, we defend them as we would defend each other." Robb, now 7 and already showing signs of the lord he would become, absorbed these lessons with particular intensity. Catelyn watched him with Jon during their training sessions, saw how naturally he deferred to his older brother in matters of strategy and leadership. If the time ever came when Jon needed protection, Robb would provide it without question, even if he never understood why. The work was exhausting and dangerous, requiring her to balance dozens of relationships and thousands of details, while maintaining the appearance of an ordinary lord's wife, concerned only with domestic matters. But as winter deepened, and reports continued to arrive about investigations into northern bastards, Catelyn found strength in the knowledge that they were no longer simply hiding a secret. They were building a foundation that could support a king. One evening, as she watched Jon help young Bran with his letters while Robb practiced sums nearby, Catelyn allowed herself a moment of fierce pride. The Hidden Prince was growing into exactly the kind of man who could unite a fractured realm. Thoughtful, protective of those weaker than himself, and possessed of a natural authority that needed no crown to validate it. Whatever storms lay ahead, they had given him the tools to weather them. The web of whispers that surrounded them was growing more complex by the day, with enemies and allies sometimes indistinguishable until circumstances forced them to reveal their true loyalties. But Catelyn Stark had learned to spin her own webs, and the threads she wove were strong enough to catch a dragon and gentle enough to cradle a sleeping child. In the great Game of Thrones, she had found her role at last, not as a player seeking power for herself, but as a guardian, ensuring that power would someday rest in worthy hands. The hidden prince would have his throne when the time was right, and until that day came, she would make certain he lived to claim it. Chapter 5. Songs of Ice and Fire. 14 years had passed since Jon Snow first drew breath in the Tower of Joy, and as he stood in Winterfell's crypts with a silver harp cradled in his hands, Catelyn Stark marveled at how destiny had a way of calling its children home. The instrument seemed to sing even when silent, its strings catching what little light filtered down from the world above, and the expression on Jon's face was one of recognition so profound it nearly stopped her heart. "Where did this come from?" Jon asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as his fingers traced the intricate dragons carved into the harp's frame. At 14, he had grown tall and lean, his dark hair framing a face that grew more like his mother's, and more dangerously like his father's, with each passing day. "It's beautiful, ancient. It feels—" He paused, struggling for words. "It feels like coming home." Catelyn had spent weeks arranging this moment, carefully placing the harp where Jon would discover it, during one of his frequent solitary walks through the crypts. She had told herself it was necessary, that Jon needed to begin understanding his heritage, even if he couldn't yet know the full truth. But watching his reaction now, seeing the way his whole being seemed to respond to an instrument that had once belonged to his true father, she wondered if she was being wise or merely cruel. "Perhaps one of our ancestors brought it back from the south," she said carefully, the lie tasting like ash on her tongue. "There are many old treasures in these crypts, things that have been forgotten by the living." Jon lifted the harp, testing its weight, and Catelyn saw something she had never witnessed before, a moment of perfect belonging. His fingers found the strings as if guided by muscle memory inherited through blood, and the notes that emerged were hauntingly beautiful. Not the simple melodies a boy might pick out by experimentation, but complex harmonies that spoke of musical understanding that ran deeper than learning. "I dream of this music sometimes," Jon said, his eyes distant as he continued to play. "In my dreams, I'm in a great hall with silver hair flowing around me, and there are dragons in the rafters watching while I sing of ice and fire, of love and loss, of promises that must be kept, even when the cost is everything." The word sent a chill through Catelyn that had nothing to do with the cold of the crypts. Jon's dreams had grown more vivid and prophetic with age, filled with imagery that connected him to his Targaryen heritage in ways that should have been impossible. Sometimes she wondered if the blood of old Valyria carried memories in it, if Jon was somehow accessing the experiences of ancestors he had never known. "What do you sing of in these dreams?" she asked, though part of her feared the answer. "A song that hasn't been written yet," Jon replied, his fingers never pausing in their movement across the strings. "About a bastard who discovers he was born to be a king, about a wolf who learns he is a dragon, about ice and fire joining to save the world from darkness." His grey eyes met hers, and in them she saw a depth of understanding that made her breath catch. "Do you think dreams can show us the future, Mother? Or do they only show us what we wish could be true?" Before Catelyn could answer, a low whine echoed through the crypts, and Ghost materialized from the shadows like a creature of legend. The albino direwolf had been Jon's constant companion since the Stark children had found the litter of pups nearly a year ago, and his bond with Jon was unlike anything Catelyn had ever witnessed. Where the other direwolves were clearly beasts, however magnificent, Ghost seemed almost supernatural in his intelligence and devotion, Now the great white wolf padded past the tombs of long-dead Stark lords, his red eyes fixed on something deeper in the crypts than any of them usually ventured. He stopped, looked back at Jon, and whined again, clearly wanting to be followed. "He's found something," Jon said, carefully setting down the harp. "He's been coming down here alone lately, always heading toward the deepest levels. I think he wants to show us what he's discovered." Catelyn felt a flutter of unease, but curiosity won over caution. They followed Ghost deeper into the crypts than she had ever gone, past tombs so old the names had worn away from their markers, past stone kings whose faces had been smoothed by centuries into anonymous blocks of granite. The air grew thicker here, heavy with the weight of ages and secrets. Ghost stopped before a section of wall that looked no different from any other, but when Jon approached, his hand trailing along the stone, something clicked. A section of the wall swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a small chamber that had been sealed for generations. Inside, barely illuminated by the torch Jon carried, lay treasures that made Catelyn's knees weak with understanding. Ancient books bound in dragonhide, their covers marked with the three-headed dragon of House Targaryen, scrolls of genealogy that traced bloodlines back to old Valyria. And most stunning of all, a circlet of silver and rubies that could only have been a prince's crown. "Gods," Jon breathed, kneeling beside the treasures. "What is all this? Why would Targaryen artifacts be hidden in the Stark crypts?" Catelyn's mind raced, trying to understand what they had found. These weren't items that could have been here since before Robert's rebellion. They were too well preserved, too carefully arranged. Someone had hidden these things recently, someone who knew their value and wanted them protected. Then understanding struck her like a physical blow. Lyanna, her good sister, had hidden these treasures here before riding south, perhaps knowing she might not return. Evidence of Jon's heritage, proof of his father's identity, kept safe in the one place Robert Baratheon would never think to look. "I don't know," she said, her voice carefully neutral even as her heart pounded. "But perhaps we should leave them here. Some secrets are meant to stay buried." But Jon was already reaching for one of the books, his movements drawn by the same instinctive recognition she had seen when he touched the harp. As he opened the ancient volume, pages of prophecy and history revealed themselves, written in the flowing script of Valyrian dragon lords. "I can read this," Jon said, wonder filling his voice. "I don't know how, but I can understand every word. It's about the prince that was promised, about a prophecy of ice and fire." His voice trailed off as he read, his face growing pale. "Mother, this speaks of a child born of ice and fire, of royal blood and wolf's honor, who will unite the realm against the darkness. It says he will be hidden until the world has need of him, raised by wolves, but destined to ride dragons." The words hung in the air between them, prophecy and truth intertwining in ways that made Catelyn's hands tremble. Jon was reading his own destiny, written centuries before his birth by seers who had glimpsed the shape of things to come. "Prophecies are dangerous things," she said carefully. "They can lead men to see meaning where none exists, to believe themselves chosen for greatness when they are simply ordinary." "But what if they're not ordinary?" Jon asked, his eyes bright with possibilities that terrified her. What if someone really was born to fulfill these words? What if there's more to their story than they've ever been told? That night, after they had resealed the hidden chamber and returned to the world above, Catelyn found sleep elusive. Her own dreams had grown strange in recent months, filled with visions that seemed to echo Jon's prophetic experiences. She would see him older, crowned in dragon scale, and ruling from a throne of black iron, while silver-haired children played at his feet. She would see dragons returning to Westeros, their wings casting shadows over armies that knelt in submission or burned in defiance. Most disturbing of all were the dreams where she saw herself standing behind that throne, no longer hiding in shadows, but acknowledged as the woman who had shaped a king. In these visions, her choices, every lie told and truth concealed, were revealed as steps in a greater dance, moves in a game that reached far beyond the petty struggles of houses and crowns. The next morning brought visitors to Winterfell, a delegation of maesters from the Citadel, travelling north to update the library's collection and conduct their own research into the historical records of the great houses. Their leader, an elderly man named Maester Qyburn, seemed particularly interested in the education of the Stark children. "Your bastard son shows remarkable learning," Qyburn commented to Ned during the evening feast, his pale eyes fixed on Jon with undisguised curiosity. "His understanding of history and lineage is quite sophisticated. Tell me, Lord Stark, have you given thought to sending him to the Citadel? Such talents should not be wasted in the obscurity of bastardry." Catelyn felt her breath catch, recognizing the danger in the Maester's seemingly innocent interest. Jon's education had been carefully designed to prepare him for leadership, not for the life of a scholarly brother. That such preparation was now visible to outside observers meant they were approaching a crossroads where secrecy might no longer be possible. "Jon will find his own path in time," Ned replied carefully. "For now, he serves House Stark as family should, regardless of birth." Curious, Qyburn mused, his gaze shifting to Catelyn. "Most lords are less invested in their bastard's intellectual development. Your boy carries himself with unusual confidence for one of uncertain birth, almost as if he knows something about his worth that others do not." The words were delivered with the casual air of academic observation, but Catelyn heard the threat beneath them. This man suspected something, had perhaps been sent north specifically to investigate rumors about the Stark bastard, whose bearing was too noble, whose education was too complete, whose very existence posed questions that dangerous men wanted answered. That night, alone in their solar, Catelyn and Ned faced a truth they had long avoided discussing. "He's becoming impossible to hide," Catelyn said, her voice heavy with exhaustion and fear. "Every day he grows more like what he truly is, and every day more people notice. The dreams, the musical ability, the way he reads prophecies like they were written for him. It's all becoming too obvious." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we may need to prepare him for the truth sooner than we hoped. If he's going to be discovered anyway, better that he understands his heritage before someone else reveals it." Catelyn moved to stand beside her husband, their hands finding each other in the darkness. "He's strong enough now, wise enough, and if we wait much longer, we may lose the chance to tell him ourselves." Ned nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what she was suggesting. After 14 years of careful protection, the time was approaching when Jon Snow would need to learn that he was Aegon Targaryen, rightful heir to the Iron Throne. The Hidden Prince was ready to discover his crown, whether the world was ready for him or not. In the crypts far below, Rhaegar's harp waited in patient silence, while ancient prophecies whispered of ice and fire, of princes and promises, of a destiny that could no longer be denied. The Game of Thrones was about to gain a player whose very existence would reshape the board, and Catelyn Stark had helped craft every move that would bring him to power. The song of ice and fire was finally ready to be sung, and the dragon disguised as a wolf was preparing to spread his wings. Chapter 6. The Hand's Gambit. The arrival of King Robert Baratheon at Winterfell came with all the pageantry and chaos that followed royalty wherever it went. But for Catelyn Stark, watching from the battlements as the royal procession wound its way through the winter town, it felt less like an honor and more like an approaching storm. 15 years had passed since Robert's rebellion ended. 15 years since she and Ned had sworn to protect the secret that could destroy them all, and now the one man who posed the greatest threat to Jon's life was riding through their gates with a crown on his head and murder in his heart for any who carried Targaryen blood. "He's grown fat," Ned observed, standing beside her as they watched the king dismount with considerable effort. Gone was the warrior who had wielded his war hammer at the trident, replaced by a man whose appetites had clearly outgrown his discipline. But the eyes, those were the same blue eyes that had burned with rage when he spoke of Rhaegar Targaryen's crimes, the same eyes that had lit with satisfaction when presented with the corpses of Targaryen children. "Fat and dangerous," Catelyn murmured, her gaze finding Jon in the courtyard below. At 15, her nephew had grown into a young man who commanded attention wherever he went, tall and lean like his father had been, with dark hair that caught the light like black silk, and grey eyes that held depths of understanding that made grown men pause when they met them. He stood with his siblings, Robb, Sansa, Arya, Bran, and little Rickon. But even among family, his bearing set him apart. There was a natural authority in the way he held himself, a dignity that no amount of bastard's training could fully suppress, and Robert, even from a distance, was watching him. The feast that evening was a magnificent affair, as befitted the visit of a king to the seat of his oldest friend. The great hall blazed with the light of 100 candles, and the finest foods Winterfell could provide filled the long tables where northern lords sat alongside southern visitors. But Catelyn found no joy in the festivities, too aware of the dangerous undercurrents flowing beneath the surface of courtesy and celebration. Robert held court at the high table like a man born to command, regaling the assembled lords with tales of battles fought and victories won. His voice boomed across the hall as he spoke of the good old days, of friendships forged in war and enemies vanquished in righteous fury. But his eyes, Catelyn noticed, kept drifting to where Jon sat among the younger men, studying the boy with an intensity that made her stomach clench with fear. "Tell me, Ned," Robert said, during a lull in conversation, his voice carrying easily across the high table. "Your bastard there. Jon, isn't it? He's grown into a fine young man. Looks like he has the makings of a warrior." "He trains hard," Ned replied carefully, his tone neutral, but Catelyn could see the tension in his shoulders. "All the boys do." "Good, good. Important for a man to know how to fight, even a bastard." Robert's laugh was hearty, but there was something calculating in his gaze. "Though I must say, he carries himself well for one born on the wrong side of the sheets. Almost noble bearing, wouldn't you say? Reminds me of someone, though I can't quite place who." The words fell into the hall like stones into still water, creating ripples of unease that spread outward from the high table. Catelyn felt her breath catch, recognizing the trap being laid. Robert wasn't making casual conversation. He was probing, testing, watching for reactions that might confirm whatever suspicions he harbored. "The Stark blood runs true," Catelyn said smoothly, inserting herself into the conversation before Ned could respond. "Even in those born outside marriage, Jon has always been well-behaved and dutiful to his family." "Has he now?" Robert's attention shifted to her, his blue eyes sharp despite the wine he had consumed. "And what do you make of him, Lady Catelyn? Most wives are not so understanding about their husbands' youthful indiscretions." The question was loaded with implications, and Catelyn understood that she was being tested as thoroughly as Ned. Robert was looking for the jealousy and resentment he would expect from a wife confronted with living proof of her husband's infidelity. Her response would either allay his suspicions or confirm them. "John has been part of our household since birth," she said, allowing a carefully measured note of resignation into her voice. "I have learned to accept what cannot be changed. He serves the family with honor, as is proper." Accepting. Yes, I can see that. Robert nodded slowly, but his gaze remained calculating. "Though I wonder sometimes about the mothers of such children. Tell me, Ned, do you ever hear from this Willa, was it? Does she ask after her son?" Catelyn felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, recognizing the moment when their carefully constructed story might crumble. Robert wasn't asking out of idle curiosity. He was testing the details, looking for inconsistencies that might reveal the truth they had worked so hard to hide. "Willa died some years ago," Ned said quietly, the lie delivered with perfect conviction. "A fever took her. She never sought contact with John, understanding that his place was here, with family. Tragic. How very tragic." Robert's expression was sorrowful, but his eyes remained cold and watchful. "And John? Does he mourn for the mother he never knew?" Before Ned could answer, a commotion at the lower tables provided a welcome distraction. Some minor dispute between young lordlings that required attention, drawing Robert's focus away from his dangerous questions. But Catelyn knew this was only a reprieve. The king's suspicions had been aroused, and he would not easily let the matter rest. Later that evening, as the feast wound down and guests began seeking their chambers, Catelyn found herself alone with Robert in the solar. He had requested a private word with her, ostensibly to discuss arrangements for the royal visit, but she suspected his true purpose was more interrogation. "You keep a fine household, Lady Catelyn," Robert said, settling his bulk into a chair that creaked ominously under his weight. "Your children are a credit to House Stark. All of them." He paused meaningfully. "Even the bastard." "Thank you, Your Grace. We try to instill proper values in all who live under our roof." "I'm sure you do." Robert studied her face with the intensity of a hunter tracking prey. "Tell me truthfully, as one who knew me in my youth, do you think John resembles anyone? Anyone from the old days, perhaps?" The question hung in the air between them, fraught with deadly implications. Catelyn understood that she was being offered a chance to confess, to reveal the truth, and throw herself on Robert's mercy. But she also knew there would be no mercy, not for a woman who had harbored a Targaryen heir for 15 years, and certainly not for the boy himself. "I see only Stark in him," she said firmly, meeting Robert's gaze without flinching. "The coloring, the build, the temperament. He is Ned's son in all the ways that matter." "Yes, the coloring is very Stark," Robert agreed, but there was something in his tone that suggested he found her answer less than satisfying. Dark hair, grey eyes. Very northern. Though I must say, there's something in his bearing that speaks of grander breeding. The way he moves, the way others respond to him. Almost as if he knows something about his worth that others do not. The observation was too close to truth for comfort, and Catelyn felt sweat gathering between her shoulder blades, despite the coolness of the evening. Perhaps living as he has, neither fully family nor truly apart from it, has given him a different perspective. Some bastards learn to carry themselves with dignity as a form of protection. Perhaps. Robert was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant, as if lost in memory. "I had dreams, you know, after the war. Dreams of silver-haired children rising from their graves to claim vengeance. John Arryn told me it was guilt, the natural consequence of harsh but necessary justice. But sometimes," he looked directly at her, and in his eyes she saw not just suspicion, but a kind of desperate hope. Sometimes I wonder if my dreams were warnings, if something survived that should have died. Catelyn felt the weight of 15 years of deception pressing down on her, the burden of protecting a secret that could reshape the Seven Kingdoms. But she also felt the fierce love of a mother protecting her child, the determination that had carried her through years of careful lies and patient planning. "The Targaryens are gone, Your Grace," she said with quiet conviction. "They died with Aerys and his children. What remains are memories and nightmares, nothing more." Robert studied her a moment longer, then nodded slowly. Yes, I suppose you're right. The dragons are dead, and good riddance to them." He pushed himself to his feet with a grunt of effort. "Though I confess, I sleep better, knowing that men like your husband stand between the realm and any who might seek to bring them back." After Robert departed for his chambers, Catelyn remained in the solar, her hands shaking with the aftermath of the most dangerous conversation of her life. She had navigated the minefield of royal suspicion and emerged with their secret intact. But she knew the ground remained treacherous. Robert suspected something, even if he couldn't prove it, and his presence at Winterfell posed a constant threat to everything they had worked to protect. The next morning brought news that made her blood run cold. Robert had come north, not merely to visit an old friend, but to offer Ned the position of Hand of the King. Jon Arryn was dead, and the realm needed someone Robert trusted to help rule in his stead. "I can't go," Ned said when they discussed it privately, the weight of Robert's offer heavy between them. "I can't leave Jon unprotected with Robert's suspicions aroused." But Catelyn knew that refusing the king's request would only deepen those suspicions, make Robert wonder what secrets Ned was so desperate to protect. The trap was perfectly laid. Accept the position and leave Jon vulnerable, or refuse and practically confess that there was something to hide. "What if we compromise?" she said finally, the solution forming as she spoke. "You go south, but Jon remains here, under my protection, with loyal men around him. Robert can't very well insist that a bastard boy accompany his father to King's Landing." It was not perfect, but it was the best of terrible options. Ned would serve as Hand, keeping Robert's attention focused on southern matters, while Catelyn maintained the conspiracy that had protected Jon for 15 years. The family would be separated, but the secret would remain safe. That evening, as preparations for departure began in earnest, Catelyn found herself alone with Jon in the Godswood. He stood beneath the heart tree, his face thoughtful in the dappled light that filtered through the red leaves, and she marveled again at how much he had grown, how closely he resembled the portrait she had seen of his true father. "You know, don't you?" Jon said quietly, not turning to look at her. "You know that I'm different, that there's something about me that doesn't fit the story everyone tells." Catelyn felt her heart stop, wondering how much truth he had divined from the careful gaps in his history. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've never felt like just a bastard," Jon replied, finally turning to face her. "I've always felt like I'm waiting for something, like my real life hasn't started yet. And the way people look at me sometimes, the way you look at me." He paused, his grey eyes holding an adult seriousness that made her chest tighten. "I know you care for me, more than you've ever let on. More than most wives would care for their husband's bastard. Why?" The question hung between them, honest and direct, demanding an answer that she couldn't give without revealing everything. But perhaps, Catelyn thought, it was time to give him part of the truth, enough to satisfy his curiosity, without exposing the dangerous reality. "Because you're not just Ned's bastard," she said finally, choosing her words with infinite care. Your family. You're part of us in ways that go beyond the circumstances of your birth. And someday, when you're ready, you'll understand just how important you really are." Jon studied her face for a long moment, and she saw in his eyes the same intuitive understanding that had always set him apart. He knew there was more to the story, but he was content to wait for the full truth to reveal itself in time. "Will you protect me while Father is gone?" he asked, and there was something in the question that suggested he understood the stakes better than she had realized. "Always," Catelyn promised, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "Whatever comes, whatever threatens you, I will be here. You have my word." As the sun set over Winterfell's ancient walls, the woman who had spent 15 years hiding a prince made a new vow to the young man who was beginning to suspect his own importance. The Game of Thrones was calling Ned Stark south, but the true prize would remain in the north, protected by a mother's love and a conspiracy that had grown strong enough to challenge kings. The Hand's Gambit had begun, but Catelyn Stark was ready to play her own game, with stakes higher than any crown and a prize more precious than any throne. Chapter 7. The Mother's Gambit. The scream that echoed across Winterfell's courtyard on that grey autumn morning shattered more than just the peaceful quiet of the castle. It shattered Catelyn Stark's carefully ordered world and left her facing an impossible choice between protecting one child and saving another. Bran lay broken at the base of the First Keep's tower, his small body twisted at angles that made her stomach lurch, and as she knelt beside him in the mud and blood, her mind raced with terrible calculations that had nothing to do with a mother's natural grief and everything to do with the secrets that could destroy them all. "He was climbing," Maester Luwin said, his voice heavy with sorrow as he examined the boy's injuries. "The broken tower, my lady. I've told him countless times that those ruins are unsafe, but you know how Bran loves to climb." Catelyn nodded, her throat too tight for words. But even through her fear for her son, part of her mind was working with the cold precision of a woman who had spent 15 years protecting dangerous truths. Bran was an expert climber, sure-footed as a mountain goat, and careful to a fault. He would never have fallen from a tower he had scaled dozens of times before, which meant this was no accident. As the hours stretched into days, and Bran lay unconscious in his bed, tended by maesters and scepters, while Catelyn kept her vigil at his bedside, pieces of a darker picture began to emerge. The royal party had departed Winterfell the same morning as Bran's fall, but servants whispered of strange comings and goings in the night. A gold-cloaked guard had been seen near the broken tower just before dawn. Queen Cersei had asked pointed questions about which towers offered the best views of the castle grounds. Most telling of all, Jaime Lannister had been notably absent from the farewell ceremonies, claiming illness that no one could verify. "They tried to kill him," Catelyn said to herself one night as she sat beside Bran's still form, the words falling into the darkness like stones into a well. But why? What could a child have seen that was worth murder? The answer came to her with the cold clarity of winter wind. Bran had been climbing that tower because he had seen something, or someone, in the room below. Something important enough that witnesses needed to be eliminated. And if the Lannisters were willing to murder a child to protect their secrets, what would they do if they discovered hers? The realization struck her like a physical blow. Jon. They had to get Jon away from Winterfell before whoever had tried to kill Bran realized that the bastard boy posed an even greater threat to their plans. If the Lannisters had been willing to move against the Stark family once, they would do so again, and Jon's very existence made him a target beyond anything they could imagine. "Luwin," she called, her voice cutting through the hushed atmosphere of the sick room. "Send for John, immediately." When John arrived, still wearing his practice leathers and smelling of sweat and steel from the training yard, Catelyn felt her heart contract with love and fear in equal measure. At 15, he had grown into a young man of striking presence, his dark hair framing a face that grew more like Rhaegar's with each passing day. If any Lannister loyalist with knowledge of the old kings looked closely at Jon Snow, they might see more than just another northern bastard. "How is he?" Jon asked, his grey eyes fixed on Bran's pale face with an expression of such genuine grief that Catelyn had to remind herself that this boy knew nothing of crowns or thrones, only that his little brother lay dying. "The same," she said softly. "But Jon, I need you to listen carefully. I think Bran's fall was no accident. I think someone tried to kill him because of something he saw, and that means all of us are in danger." Jon's face went very still, and she saw the quick intelligence that made him so dangerous to their enemies and so precious to their cause. "What do you need me to do?" "I need you to leave Winterfell. Tonight, if possible." The words felt like tearing her own heart out, but she pressed on. "Your Uncle Benjen has been expecting a visit from you for months. Go to the Wall. Stay there until I send word that it's safe to return. Tell anyone who asks that you're considering taking the Black, that you want to learn more about your options." "You want me to run?" Jon said, and there was no accusation in his voice, only understanding. "You want me to hide?" "I want you to live," Catelyn replied fiercely, reaching out to take his hands in hers. "You're important, Jon. More important than you know. And if something happens to me, if I don't come back from—" She stopped, realizing she was about to reveal more than she had intended. "You're going after Father," Jon said, his voice certain. "You think he's in danger too?" Catelyn nodded, unable to deny it. Every instinct she possessed screamed that Ned was walking into a trap, that his honor and trust were being used against him by enemies who understood neither quality. But she couldn't abandon Bran to chase after her husband, and she couldn't leave Jon unprotected while she tried to save them both. "Promise me you'll go to the Wall," she said urgently. "Promise me you'll stay there until I know it's safe. Your uncle will protect you, and the Night's Watch is neutral ground. Even kings think twice before interfering with the sworn brothers." Jon studied her face for a long moment, and she saw the moment when he made his decision. "I promise." "But Mother—" He used the word deliberately, as he had since childhood, and the sound of it made her eyes burn with unshed tears. "Promise me you'll come back. Whatever you're planning, whatever you're afraid of, promise me you'll survive it and come home." "I promise," she whispered, though they both knew how little control she had over such things. That night, as Jon prepared for his departure to the Wall, Catelyn found herself in her solar with Maester Luwin, crafting letters that might be the most important documents she ever wrote. Some were coded messages to her network of allies, warning them that the game had changed and that Jon's protection was now paramount. Others were instructions for Robb, who would need to hold Winterfell in her absence while managing threats he couldn't fully understand. But the most crucial letter was one she sealed with her personal signet and placed in Luwin's hands, with instructions that made the old Maester's eyes go wide with shock. "If I don't return within 2 moons," she told him quietly, "you are to give this to Jon. Not to Robb, not to any of my other children, but to Jon specifically. And Luwin," she met his eyes directly, "you are to ensure he reads it alone, in complete privacy, with no witnesses to his reaction. My lady, what does this letter contain?" "The truth," Catelyn said simply, "about who he really is, who his parents were, and why his life has been lived as it has. Everything he needs to know to protect himself if we're not here to do it for him." Lewin's face went pale with understanding. The Maester was not stupid, and 15 years of careful observation had given him clues that he had been too discreet to voice aloud. But now, faced with the reality of what Catelyn was entrusting to him, he could no longer pretend ignorance. "Are you certain this is wise?" "No," Catelyn admitted. "But it's necessary. If the worst happens, if our enemies discover what we've been protecting, Jon will need to know the truth to have any chance of survival. He'll need to understand why people want him dead, and more importantly, why others might be willing to die for him." The farewell between Catelyn and Jon took place in the God's Wood, beneath the ancient heart tree where she had first accepted the burden of protecting him. Ghost waited nearby, the great white direwolf somehow sensing the gravity of the moment, while Jon stood before her with the quiet dignity that marked him as different from other boys his age. "I know there are things you're not telling me," Jon said softly, his breath misting in the cold air. "I've known for years that my story doesn't make complete sense, that there are gaps and inconsistencies that no one will explain. But I want you to know that I trust you. Whatever secrets you're keeping, I trust that you're keeping them for good reasons." Catelyn felt tears threatening, overwhelmed by the maturity and understanding of this boy. No, this young man, who had grown into someone worthy of the crown he didn't know was his. "Someday," she said carefully, "when the time is right, you'll understand everything. And when that day comes, I hope you'll remember that every choice we made, every lie we told, was because we loved you." "I know," Jon said simply, and stepped forward to embrace her with a fierceness that spoke to his understanding of what this parting might mean. "Take care of yourself, Mother. Take care of Bran. And don't let honor be father's downfall the way it was for so many good men before him." As she watched Jon ride north toward the wall with his small escort, Catelyn felt the weight of 15 years settling on her shoulders like a mantle of lead. She had sent her greatest treasure away to keep him safe, but in doing so, she had also acknowledged that the game they had been playing in the shadows was about to move into the light. The enemies who had tried to murder Bran would not stop there, and the friends who had helped protect Jon might soon find themselves choosing between loyalty and survival. 3 days later, when the assassin came in, the knight with a blade meant for Bran's throat, Catelyn was ready. The man died on the end of Summer's teeth, but not before she had extracted enough information to confirm her worst fears. The Lannisters were indeed behind the attempt on Bran's life, and their reach extended far enough to hire killers even in the heart of the north. As she held the Valyrian steel dagger that would have ended her son's life, Catelyn understood that the time for half measures and careful planning had passed. Ned was in King's Landing, surrounded by enemies he was too honorable to recognize. Jon was at the wall, protected for now, but vulnerable if their secrets were exposed. Bran lay helpless in his bed, a witness to crimes that powerful people would kill to keep hidden. The Mother's Gambit had begun in earnest, and Catelyn Stark would either save her family or die trying. The Game of Thrones demanded everything from those who played it, and she was finally ready to pay the price. As she prepared for her journey south, carrying evidence that might damn queens and topple kingdoms, Catelyn allowed herself one last look at her sleeping son. Bran would recover. The Maesters were confident of that now, but he would never walk again. The Lannisters had taken that from him, had tried to take his life, and had set in motion events that threatened to destroy everything she had worked to build. They would pay for that crime, and for the greater crime of forcing her to send her hidden prince away when he should have been learning to rule. The wolves of Winterfell were going to war, and when the dust settled, the realm would remember why the North had never been conquered by any save dragons. And perhaps, if the gods were kind, when the fighting was done, there would still be a throne for a hidden prince to claim, and a kingdom for him to rule, with the wisdom she had spent 15 years teaching him. The mother's gambit was the most dangerous game she had ever played, but the stakes were worth any risk. Jon Snow would survive to become Aegon Targaryen, King of the Seven Kingdoms, if she had to burn the world to make it happen. Chapter 8. Revelation in the Capital. The smell of King's Landing hit Catelyn Stark like a physical blow. Sewage and sweat, rotting fish and burning pitch, the accumulated stench of 500,000 souls, crowded into a city that had never been designed to hold them all. But it was not the smell that made her stomach clench with fear as her party approached the Red Keep's gates. It was the sight of her husband's banner flying upside down from the Tower of the Hand, the traditional sign that its lord had fallen from grace. She was too late. Whatever trap had been laid for Ned had already sprung, and now she faced the nightmare scenario she had spent weeks racing south to prevent. Her husband was a prisoner, her family's enemies held all the power in the capital, and the secret that had shaped 15 years of her life was about to be tested in the crucible of royal politics. "My lady," Sir Roderick said quietly, his weathered face grim as he studied the guards at the gates. "Perhaps we should withdraw, send messages, learn more before we—" "No." Catelyn's voice cut through his concern with the sharp edge of desperate determination. "If we run now, Ned dies. If we stay, there's a chance, a small one, but a chance that something can be salvaged from this disaster." The chance, she knew, might cost everything they had worked to protect. But 15 years of guarding Jon's secret had taught her that sometimes the greatest risks were necessary to preserve what mattered most. And what mattered now was learning exactly how much their enemies knew and what price they might demand for mercy. The meeting with Tyrion Lannister came sooner than expected, arranged through intermediaries who whispered of mutual interests and shared concerns about the realm's stability. The youngest Lannister son received her in a tavern near the docks, his mismatched eyes bright with intelligence as he studied her across a table sticky with spilled wine. "Lady Stark," Tyrion said, his voice carrying none of the mockery she had expected. "I confess myself surprised to see you in the capital. Most wives would be gathering their banners and preparing for war, not walking into the dragon's mouth to negotiate for their husband's life." "Most husbands are not Ned Stark," Catelyn replied carefully, studying the dwarf's face for signs of the trap she was certain lay hidden in this conversation. "And most wives do not have as much to lose. Ah, yes, your children." Tyrion's smile was knowing, but not unkind. "Robb, who will soon be Lord of Winterfell if your husband loses his head. Sansa, who my nephew seems quite taken with, despite her father's current difficulties. Arya, who has apparently vanished like morning mist. My sister is quite upset about that. Young Bran, who survived his fall but will never walk again. And little Rickon, too young to understand why his world is crumbling around him." The recitation was accurate as far as it went, but Catelyn noticed the deliberate omission and felt her heart skip a beat. "You seem well informed about my family's circumstances." "Information is the most valuable commodity in King's Landing," Tyrion said, reaching for his wine cup. "Though I confess some information is more valuable than others. For instance, the whereabouts of certain family members, who might not be immediately visible to those seeking to do them harm." The words were carefully neutral, but Catelyn heard the implied threat beneath them. Tyrion knew about Jon, or suspected enough to make his knowledge dangerous. The question was what he intended to do with that knowledge, and what price he might demand for his silence. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "Of course not. Just as I'm sure you don't know why my father's men have been asking questions about bastards throughout the north, or why certain ravens have been intercepted carrying coded messages about protecting family treasures from those who might not appreciate their true value." Tyrion's eyes never left her face. "The Game of Thrones makes players of us all, Lady Stark. The wise ones learn to recognize when they're holding cards that others desperately want." Before Catelyn could respond, the tavern door opened, and a hooded figure slipped inside, moving with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to walking in shadows. Lord Varys, the spider himself, his hands folded within his sleeves as he approached their table with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Lady Stark, Lord Tyrion," Varys said, his voice carrying the silky tones that had whispered secrets to kings for decades. "I do hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Just a friendly conversation between concerned parties," Tyrion replied, though his hand moved to rest casually near his dagger. "Though I suspect you have business with Lady Stark that doesn't concern me." "How perceptive." "Yes, the lady and I have much to discuss." Varys settled into a chair with careful precision, his pale eyes fixed on Catelyn with unsettling intensity. "Particularly regarding certain northern concerns. That may be of mutual interest." Catelyn felt the walls closing in around her, understanding that this meeting had been orchestrated from the moment she entered the city. Varys and Tyrion weren't here by coincidence. They had been waiting for her, prepared to spring whatever trap they had set for the woman who had spent 15 years protecting the realm's most dangerous secret. "Speak plainly," she said, abandoning pretense in favor of direct confrontation. "What do you want?" "What I have always wanted," Varys replied smoothly. "The stability and prosperity of the realm. Unfortunately, recent events have created complications that threaten that stability. Your husband's arrest, the king's death, young Joffrey's ascension to the throne. All of these things have upset delicate balances that took years to establish." The mention of Robert's death sent a chill through Catelyn that had nothing to do with the tavern's drafty walls. If Robert was truly dead, then Jon was in even greater danger than she had imagined. Joffrey Baratheon, or Joffrey Waters, if the whispered rumors about his parentage were true, had neither his supposed father's friendship with Ned nor any reason to show mercy to Targaryen claimants. "The king is dead?" she asked, though she already knew the answer from Varys's expression. "A hunting accident. Most unfortunate." The spider's tone suggested anything but genuine regret. "Which brings us to the matter at hand. With Robert gone and his heir on the throne, certain previously protected individuals may find themselves in rather precarious positions." The conversation was dancing around the truth with elaborate courtesy, but Catelyn understood the subtext perfectly. Varys knew about Jon, had probably known for years, and was now offering protection in exchange for something she wasn't yet prepared to give. "What kind of protection?" she asked carefully. "The kind that ensures valuable assets remain safe while the realm sorts out its current difficulties," Varys replied. "Though such protection does require considerations from those who benefit from it. Information, perhaps, or future cooperation when circumstances change." "You're asking me to turn my back on my husband to save a bastard boy," Catelyn said, testing the waters of how much Varys truly knew. The spider's smile was gentle and terrible. "I'm asking you to consider which choice serves the greater good. Lord Stark is a good man, an honorable man, but his honor may not survive the game he's chosen to play. The boy, on the other hand, the boy represents possibilities that extend far beyond the current crisis. Tyrion was watching this exchange with fascination, his quick mind clearly working to fill in the gaps in his knowledge. But it was Varys who concerned Catelyn most, because she was beginning to understand that the spider hadn't just stumbled across Jon's secret. He had been actively protecting it, probably since the boy's birth. "How long have you known?" she asked quietly. "I suspected when Lord Stark returned from Dorne with an infant whose timing was convenient. I became certain when certain interested parties began making inquiries about northern bastards and found their investigations mysteriously frustrated by missing records and uncooperative witnesses." Varys leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I have spent 15 years ensuring that particular truth remained buried, Lady Stark. The question now is whether you're prepared to help me continue that protection, even if it means making difficult choices about other loyalties." The weight of 15 years of deception settled on Catelyn's shoulders as she stared at the man who had apparently been her silent partner in protecting Jon without her knowledge. Varys had been playing a longer game than any of them realized, positioning pieces on a board that extended far beyond the current crisis. "What about my husband?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "Lord Stark's fate was sealed the moment he chose honor over pragmatism," Varys said, with what might have been genuine regret. "But his death need not be meaningless if it serves to protect something more valuable than one man's life, however noble that life might be." The choice crystallized in that moment, with brutal clarity. Save Ned by revealing Jon's identity and rallying support for a Targaryen restoration, thus putting Jon directly in the crosshairs of every enemy the dragons had ever made. Or protect Jon by letting Ned die, preserving the secret that might someday save the realm, but sacrificing the man who had made that secret possible. Catelyn closed her eyes and saw Ned's face as he had looked that night 15 years ago, when he first told her about the Tower of Joy, about Lyanna's promise, about the choice between friendship and family. He had chosen family then, chosen to risk Robert's wrath to save his nephew's life. Now she had to make the same choice, and she knew with sick certainty what Ned would want her to do. "There's another way," she said suddenly, an idea forming even as she spoke. "Ned confesses to treason, takes the black, goes to the wall. Joffrey gets to look merciful. Ned gets to live. And—" She paused, understanding the full implications of what she was suggesting. "And Jon gets his father figure back, along with someone who can help protect him if the truth ever comes out." Varys and Tyrion exchanged a look that spoke of rapid calculation and grudging respect. "It could work," Tyrion said slowly. "Joffrey likes to play the merciful king when it suits his image, and the wall is far enough from King's Landing that a disgraced hand would pose no immediate threat. More importantly," Varys added, "it would position certain assets where they could be most useful if circumstances change. The Night's Watch has always been politically neutral, but neutral doesn't mean powerless." As the three conspirators worked out the details of their desperate gambit, Catelyn felt the weight of the game she had been drawn into settling fully onto her shoulders. She was no longer just protecting a secret. She was actively shaping the realm's future, making choices that could elevate kings or destroy dynasties. The hidden prince at the wall would have his protective father figure restored to him, along with allies positioned to support him when the time came for revelations. Ned would live, though in exile, and the secret that had shaped their lives for 15 years would remain safe for now. But the cost of this protection was Catelyn's acceptance that the Game of Thrones had claimed her family completely. There would be no going back to the simple lies and careful evasions that had sufficed when Robert lived. From now on, every choice would be weighed against the ultimate goal of seeing Jon safely to his destiny, whatever the price, in blood and honor. As she prepared to return to the Red Keep and set their plan in motion, Catelyn allowed herself one last moment of grief for the woman she had been before this war began. That woman had hoped to protect her family through careful secrecy and patient planning. The woman who emerged from this tavern understood that protection sometimes required sacrifice, that love sometimes demanded the courage to let go. The revelation in the capital had changed everything, but the core mission remained the same. Keep Jon Snow alive until the day he could safely become Aegon Targaryen. Everything else, honor, comfort, even the lives of those she loved, was secondary to that single, overwhelming purpose. The Game of Thrones had claimed House Stark, but it had not yet claimed their hidden prince. And Catelyn would see to it that it never did, no matter what the cost to herself or anyone else who stood in the way of Jon's destiny. Chapter 9. The Dragon Awakens. The raven that arrived at Castle Black on a grey morning carried news that shattered Jon Snow's world more completely than any sword stroke ever could. Ned Stark, the only father he had ever known, had confessed to treason before the Iron Throne, his honor stripped away like a cloak in winter wind, his life forfeit, except for the mercy that would see him take the Black, rather than lose his head to the executioner's axe. Jon stood in the rookery with Maester Aemon, the letter trembling in his hands as the words blurred together through the haze of shock and disbelief. Confessed to treason rang in his mind like a bell tolling for the dead, because the Ned Stark who had raised him would never have betrayed his king, would never have chosen dishonor over death. "It cannot be true," Jon whispered, his voice barely audible above the cawing of ravens. "He would never. Father would never." "Honor is a luxury, boy," Maester Aemon said gently, his blind eyes turned toward sounds of anguish he had heard too many times in his long life. "Sometimes good men make hard choices to protect what matters more than their own reputation. Your father, Lord Stark, may have had reasons we cannot understand." But Jon was no longer listening. The letter slipped from his nerveless fingers as he stumbled from the rookery, his world tilting off its axis as everything he had believed about honor and family crumbled around him. He had come to the wall thinking he might take the Black, might find purpose in defending the realm from the dangers beyond. Now he felt truly lost, more alone than any bastard had ever been. The days that followed passed in a blur of training and duty that felt meaningless against the weight of his grief. His brothers in black tried to offer comfort in their rough way, but what comfort could there be for a boy whose father had fallen so far from grace? Even Uncle Benjen's presence brought little solace. The first ranger had been kind, but distant, clearly struggling with his own shock at his brother's downfall. It was on the 7th day after the Raven's arrival that Jon saw the small party approaching Castle Black's gates, travelling under banners that made his breath catch in his throat. Stark colours, but carried by riders whose faces he didn't recognize. As the group drew closer, his heart nearly stopped as he recognized the slight figure at their head, travel-stained and weary but unmistakably familiar. Catelyn had come to the wall. The reunion took place in Benjen's Solar, away from curious eyes and wagging tongues. Jon had expected coolness from the woman who had never been able to fully accept his presence at Winterfell, but instead he found himself wrapped in an embrace so fierce it nearly brought him to tears. "My boy," Catelyn whispered against his hair, her voice thick with emotion he had never heard from her before. "My dear, brave boy, I'm so sorry you had to learn of this alone." Is it true? John asked, pulling back to study her face. Did father really? Your father made an impossible choice to protect what he loved most, Catelyn said carefully, her eyes bright with tears. He chose life over honor, chose the future over the past. And someday, when you understand everything, you'll know why that choice was the most honorable thing he could have done. John stared at her, confusion warring with the desperate hope that there was more to this story than the simple narrative of disgrace and exile. I don't understand. Catelyn looked toward Benjen, who nodded slowly and quietly left the solar, closing the door behind him with deliberate care. When they were alone, she turned back to John with an expression unlike anything he had ever seen on her face. Love and fear and determination all mingled together in a way that made his pulse quicken with anticipation. "Sit down, John," she said softly. "There are things you need to know. Things that have been kept from you for 15 years to protect your life, but which you must understand now if you're to survive what's coming." John sank into a chair, his grey eyes never leaving her face as she took a seat across from him. For a moment, she simply stared at him, as if memorizing every feature, and he felt the strangest sensation that this moment would divide his life into before and after with the precision of a blade. "Do you remember the stories I used to tell you about earning names through deeds?" Catelyn asked. "About how a man's worth isn't determined by the circumstances of his birth, but by the choices he makes and the honor he shows?" "Yes, but John, your father, Ned, confessed to treason because the alternative was revealing a secret that would have gotten you killed. He chose disgrace to protect you, chose the wall to stay close enough to keep you safe." Catelyn leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Because you are not who you think you are. You are not Ned Stark's bastard son." The words hit John like a physical blow, leaving him breathless and disoriented. What do you mean?" "I mean that the story of your birth, the story of your parentage, has been a carefully constructed lie told to keep you alive." Catelyn's hands clenched in her lap as she fought for the right words to change a boy's entire understanding of himself. "You were not born to some common woman named Willa. You were not conceived in dishonor or born in shame." John felt the world spinning around him, all the certainties he had built his life upon, crumbling like sand. "Then who?" "Your father was Prince Rhaegar Targaryen," Catelyn said, the words falling into the room like stones into still water. "Your mother was my good sister, Lyanna Stark. You are Aegon Targaryen, the rightful heir to the Iron Throne, and everything you have ever been told about your origins was a lie designed to keep Robert Baratheon from murdering you in your cradle." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the crackle of logs in the fireplace and the distant sounds of men going about their duties beyond the solar's walls. John stared at Catelyn, his mind struggling to process words that seemed to rearrange reality itself. "No," he whispered finally. That can't be true. I'm nobody. I'm just a bastard. You are the son of a prince who loved your mother more than his own life," Catelyn said fiercely, her voice gaining strength as she saw his disbelief. "You are the child Lyanna Stark died giving birth to, the baby she made Ned promise to protect from a king who would have killed you for your father's name. You are the hidden prince I have spent 15 years learning to love and protect, even when I didn't understand what you would become." John's breath came in short gasps as memories flooded through him, all the times he had felt different, all the dreams of dragons and thrones, all the moments when he had sensed there was more to his story than anyone would tell him. The dreams, he said suddenly. The dreams of flying, of silver-haired women calling me by another name. Dragon dreams, Catelyn confirmed, the blood of old Valyria showing itself. You are your father's son in more ways than just appearance, Jon. You carry his gift for prophecy, his connection to the magical bloodlines that once ruled the known world. But Rhaegar... Jon struggled to reconcile this revelation with everything he had been taught about the man who had supposedly started the war that destroyed the realm. Everyone says he was a monster. Robert says Robert was a man consumed by jealousy and rage over losing the woman he thought belonged to him, Catelyn interrupted. Rhaegar was melancholy and scholarly, a prince who read prophecies and played his harp, and believed he had found the song of ice and fire in your mother's love. They wed in secret according to Targaryen custom, making you not just true-born, but the rightful king of the Seven Kingdoms. Jon stood abruptly, pacing to the window where he could stare out at the wall rising like a white mountain against the sky. Everything made sense now. His dreams, his strange affinity for music and poetry, the way people had always treated him with a respect that seemed beyond what any bastard deserved. But accepting the truth meant accepting that his entire life had been built on lies, that everyone he had trusted had been deceiving him. "Why tell me now?" he asked without turning around. "If it's been safe to lie for 15 years, why reveal it now?" "Because the lie is no longer enough to protect you," Catelyn said simply. "With Robert dead and Joffrey on the throne, with war breaking out across the realm, the time for hiding is over. You need to know who you are if you're going to survive what's coming. You need to understand why people will want to use you, why others will want to kill you, and why some might be willing to die for you." Jon turned back to her, and Catelyn saw in his grey eyes, Lyanna's eyes, the moment when the boy she had helped raise began the transformation into the man he was born to be. "Aegon Targaryen," he said quietly, testing the name on his tongue. "The rightful king." "If you choose to claim it," Catelyn replied, "the throne is your birthright. But birthright means nothing without the strength to take it and hold it. You can remain Jon Snow if you choose, live out your life at the wall and let others fight for crowns, or you can become what you were born to be, and fight for the realm that should be yours." Jon was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if seeking answers in the flames. When he spoke again, his voice carried a gravity that made Catelyn's heart ache with pride and fear. "The dreams I've been having, they show more than just dragons and thrones. They show darkness coming from the north, cold that kills and dead things walking. If I truly am Aegon Targaryen, if I truly carry the blood of dragons, then maybe those dreams are trying to tell me something about what's really at stake." "The prince that was promised," Catelyn whispered, remembering the prophecies Jon had read in the crypts beneath Winterfell. "The one who will unite ice and fire against the darkness." "Then we need to get word to the people who matter," Jon said, the hesitation over calling them his supporters rather than his enemies, telling her how much his world had shifted. "If war is coming, if the realm is fracturing, then maybe it's time for a Targaryen to remind everyone what dragons can do." As they began planning for a future neither had dared imagine even that morning, Catelyn felt a mixture of relief and terror that nearly overwhelmed her. The secret that had shaped 15 years of her life was finally in the open, but revealing it had also unleashed forces that could reshape the Seven Kingdoms, or destroy everything they had worked to build. The boy who had walked into this solar as Jon Snow, bastard of Winterfell, would leave it as Aegon Targaryen, rightful king of the 7 kingdoms. But more than that, he would leave as a young man who finally understood why he had always felt like he was waiting for his real life to begin. The dragon had awakened, and the realm would never be the same. Outside the solar window, the wall stretched endlessly toward the horizon, that ancient barrier between the known world and the mysteries beyond. Soon, very soon, Jon would have to decide whether to remain safe behind that wall or venture forth to claim the throne that was his by right. But first, he had to come to terms with the knowledge that everything he had believed about himself was wrong, and everything he had dreamed might actually be true. The Game of Thrones had gained its most dangerous player at last, and neither crowns nor kingdoms would ever be secure again. Chapter 10. The King in Exile. The escape from Castle Black came easier than Jon had expected, though perhaps that was because men saw what they expected to see: a bastard boy leaving to join his brother's war, accompanied by his stepmother and a handful of loyal friends. They could not see the truth that burned in his chest like dragonfire, that Aegon Targaryen was riding south to claim his birthright, carrying secrets that could reshape the 7 kingdoms. The small party that rode through the haunted forest included faces that had become precious to Jon in ways he was only beginning to understand. Samwell Tarly, whose quick mind and fierce loyalty had made him invaluable. Gren and Pip, whose simple faith in their friend had translated seamlessly into belief in their hidden prince. And Ghost, the great white direwolf, whose red eyes seemed to see futures that mortal men could only glimpse in dreams. "Tell me again why we're not riding straight to Robb," Gren said on their 3rd day south, his breath misting in the cold air as they picked their way carefully through the snow-covered wilderness. "If the lad's really who you say he is, seems like his brother would want to know." "Because knowledge is dangerous," Catelyn replied, her eyes constantly scanning the tree line for threats both natural and human. "The wrong word to the wrong person, and every enemy we have will know exactly where to find us. Some truths must be revealed carefully when we're strong enough to protect them." Jon rode in silence, lost in thoughts that felt too large for his skull to contain. 3 days ago, he had been Jon Snow, bastard of Winterfell, contemplating a life of service at the wall. Now he was Aegon Targaryen, rightful king of the 7 kingdoms, and every choice he made could determine the fate of millions. The weight of that responsibility was crushing, but beneath the fear lay something else, a sense of rightness, of destiny finally aligning with reality. "I keep expecting to wake up," he confessed to Catelyn during one of their rest stops, "to discover this is all some elaborate dream or jest. Kings don't come from bastards in the Night's Watch." "Kings come from wherever they're needed," Catelyn replied, checking the straps on her horse's saddle with the efficient movements of a woman who had learned to pack light and travel fast. "Your father, Rhaegar, was born a prince, but he would have been a poor king. Too gentle, too focused on prophecies and distant threats. You've been raised differently, harder. You understand duty and sacrifice in ways he never could." The comparison troubled Jon more than he cared to admit. In the stories, Rhaegar was either monster or martyr, depending on who told the tale. But Catelyn spoke of him as a real man, flawed and human, who had loved unwisely and died young. It was strange to think that such a man was his father, stranger still to realize that he might be called upon to succeed where Rhaegar had failed. Their destination was the Neck, that boggy wilderness where Howland Reed maintained his floating castle and where the only other living witness to Jon's birth waited with evidence that could prove his parentage to skeptical lords. The journey took them through lands ravaged by war, past burned villages and abandoned homesteads where ravens picked at bones that had once been farmers and craftsmen, guilty of nothing more than living in the path of armies. "This is what we're fighting for," Jon said one evening, as they camped in the ruins of a sept, its sept's 7 walls blackened by fire, and its pews scattered like broken teeth. Not just thrones or crowns, but for the people who suffer when great lords play their games. Samwell looked up from the book he was reading by firelight, his round face thoughtful. In the histories, the best kings are the ones who remember that ruling means serving. Your namesake, Aegon the Conqueror, united the 7 kingdoms not just through force, but by giving people something better than what they had before. "And how do I do that when the realm is tearing itself apart?" Jon asked, genuine curiosity overriding the rhetorical nature of the question. "How do I convince people to follow another Targaryen when the last one was the Mad King?" "You show them who you are through your actions," Catelyn said firmly. "You prove that you're not Aerys, not even Rhaegar. You prove that you're the king the realm needs, not the king you happen to be born to be." The neck welcomed them like an old friend, the mists and marshes parting before their guide's knowledge to reveal paths that existed only at certain tides and certain times of day. Greywater Watch rose from the waters like something out of legend, a castle that moved with the rhythms of the swamp and could vanish from sight between one moment and the next. Howland Reed waited for them in his hall, that small, sharp-eyed man whose presence at the Tower of Joy had changed the course of history. When he looked at Jon, his face showed no surprise, only the satisfaction of a man seeing long-laid plans finally coming to fruition. "You have your mother's eyes," Reed said simply, rising from his seat to bow low before the young man who had never received such deference in his life. "And something of your father's bearing, though tempered by northern steel. The realm may yet have cause to thank the gods for the Tower of Joy." The evidence Reed provided was more complete than Jon had dared hope. Marriage documents, sealed with the 3-headed dragon, written in Rhaegar's own hand. Lyanna's final letter, the original that Catelyn had burned, reproduced here in Reed's careful script with details that only someone present could have known. Most convincing of all, Rhaegar's silver harp, its blood-stained strings still carrying the melody of the song that had begun their love story. "Play it," Reed commanded, gesturing toward the instrument. "Let us hear what songs the Dragon Prince left for his son." Jon's hands found the strings as if they had always known their positions, and the melody that emerged was hauntingly beautiful, a song of love and loss, of winter roses and dragonfire, of promises kept and prices paid. As the last notes faded into silence, everyone in the hall felt the weight of destiny settling around them like a mantle. "The blood sings true," Reed said quietly. "Aegon Targaryen has come home." That night, as Jon lay awake in a bed that felt too soft after weeks of sleeping rough, he experienced the most vivid prophetic dream of his life. He saw dragons flying over King's Landing, their wings casting shadows over armies that knelt or burned according to the choices they made. He saw a woman with silver-gold hair standing beside him, her hand in his, as they faced down darkness that crept south from beyond the wall. He saw the Iron Throne, but not empty, occupied by a figure whose face he could not make out, though he sensed it was neither Joffrey nor any other current claimant. Most disturbing of all, he saw winter coming not as a season, but as an ending. A long night that would test every alliance and break every oath that was not forged in the fires of absolute necessity. "The war that matters isn't the one being fought for crowns," he said to Catelyn the next morning, describing his vision over a breakfast of fish and marsh herbs. "It's the one that's coming from the north. The dead are stirring beyond the wall, and when they march south, All our petty conflicts will seem like children's games." "Then we must be ready," Catelyn replied pragmatically, "which means you must be on the throne when that war comes, with loyal armies and strong allies, not hiding in the neck while usurpers squabble over a crown that belongs to you." The decision to make contact with Robb's forces came after days of careful debate. Jon's brother, half-brother, he corrected himself, though the distinction felt meaningless, had declared himself king in the north and was winning victories against Tywin Lannister's armies. An alliance between the Stark forces and a Targaryen claimant could change the course of the war, but only if Robb could be trusted with the truth. "He'll accept you," Catelyn said, with the confidence of a mother who knew her children's hearts. "Robb has always loved you, has always treated you as a true brother. When he learns what you really are, when he understands why Father sacrificed his honor to protect you, he'll stand with you against the world if necessary." The meeting took place in a grove of weirwoods north of the Twins, where Robb's army was camped while deciding whether to attack the bridge that controlled passage south. The young king in the north came alone, except for Grey Wind, the great direwolf whose yellow eyes studied Ghost with the wariness of one alpha encountering another. "Jon?" Robb's voice carried disbelief and joy in equal measure as he dismounted and strode forward to embrace the brother he thought he had lost to the wall. "What are you doing here? How did you escape the watch?" "I didn't escape," Jon said carefully, stepping back to study the face that was so familiar, yet somehow different, harder, marked by the weight of command and the burdens of kingship. "I was released to fulfill a greater purpose. Robb, there are things you need to know about me, about Father, about why he really confessed to treason." The revelation took longer this time, with Catelyn and Jon working together to explain 15 years of careful deception and protection. Robb listened in growing amazement and horror, his face cycling through emotions as he processed the magnitude of what he was being told. "Aegon Targaryen," he said finally, testing the name as Jon had done days before. "My brother is the rightful king of the Seven Kingdoms." "Your half-brother," Jon corrected gently. "And only if you acknowledge my claim. You've declared yourself king in the north, and that's your right by conquest and acclamation. I won't ask you to give up your crown for mine." "But you'll accept my alliance?" Robb asked, and Jon heard in his voice the tactical mind that had won battles against seasoned commanders twice his age. "The North and the Targaryens against the Lannisters and their allies?" "More than that," Jon replied, feeling the mantle of kingship settling around his shoulders for the first time. "I want you as my hand when I take the Iron Throne. I want the North as my strongest ally, my most trusted partner in rebuilding what the wars have torn apart." The strategic discussions that followed lasted late into the night, with maps spread across fallen logs and plans sketched in the dirt by firelight. They spoke of alliances to be forged and enemies to be defeated, of the logistics of feeding armies and the politics of winning hearts. But underneath it all ran the deeper current of brotherhood, reaffirmed and strengthened, of family bonds that proved stronger than crowns or kingdoms. As they prepared to part, Robb to his war, Jon to gather the forces he would need for his own campaign, the young king who had been a bastard just days before felt the weight and responsibility of true leadership for the first time. "I'll need time to prepare," Jon said, his mind already working through the challenges ahead. Allies to gather, legitimacy to establish, armies to raise. But when I move against King's Landing, I'll need to be certain of victory. The realm can't afford another failed Targaryen restoration. "Then don't fail," Robb replied simply. "Be the king the realm needs, not the king you think you should be." Father taught us both that lesson, though I think he understood it better than either of us realized. As Jon rode back toward the Neck with his small band of followers, he reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. He had begun this journey as a confused boy, fleeing the ruins of everything he thought he knew. He was ending it as a king in exile, ready to claim the throne that was his birthright and face the challenges that would define not just his reign, but the future of Westeros itself. The dragon had awakened, but more than that, it had learned to fly. Soon, very soon, the Seven Kingdoms would hear the sound of wings they had not heard for a generation, and the Game of Thrones would gain a player whose very existence changed the rules by which it was played. The war for the Iron Throne was about to begin in earnest, and Aegon Targaryen would not be denied what was his by right of blood, prophecy, and the choices of those who loved him enough to sacrifice everything for his protection. Chapter 11. The Dragon's Return. The Great Hall of Riverrun had not seen such a gathering since the early days of Robert's rebellion, when young lords and old had come together to decide the fate of kingdoms. Now, on a cold morning in late autumn, banners from across the riverlands and north filled the ancient hall as word spread that Robb Stark had called his lords to witness something that would change the course of the war forever. Jon stood in the antechamber, adjusting the fine clothes that felt strange after years of bastard's wool and night's watch black. The doublet was deep crimson silk, embroidered with the three-headed dragon in silver thread, the first time in his life he had worn his true colors. In his hands he held Rhaegar's silver harp, the weight of it both familiar and alien, while Ghost lay at his feet, the great white dire wolf's red eyes reflecting the torchlight like rubies. "Are you ready?" Catelyn asked, her own attire marking her as what she had always been, a Tully of Riverrun, but also something new, the woman who had hidden a prince for 15 years and was now prepared to reveal him to the world. "I don't know if anyone could be ready for this," Jon admitted, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what was about to happen. 15 years of being one person, and now I must convince the lords of the realm that I am someone else, entirely. "You're not someone else," Howland Reed said quietly from his position near the door, the small lord of the Neck dressed in his finest clothes, but still carrying the authority of the only living witness to Jon's birth. "You're who you've always been." The boy just learned his name. The sounds from the great hall had grown louder as more lords arrived. Jon could hear Robb's voice directing the seating arrangements, ensuring that the most important lords had clear views of what was to come. The young wolf had taken the revelation of Jon's identity with surprising grace after the initial shock, his tactical mind immediately grasping the implications of having a Targaryen claimant allied with the North. "The lords are assembled," Sir Edmure Tully announced, appearing in the doorway. "Lord Robb is ready to begin." Jon took a deep breath, feeling the weight of destiny settling around him like a cloak. Everything they had worked for, everything they had sacrificed to protect, was about to be tested in the court of public opinion. These lords had the power to make him a king or see him dismissed as an elaborate fraud, and their decision would echo across the 7 kingdoms. The great hall fell silent as Jon entered, every eye fixed on the young man who walked with the confidence of nobility, but whose face was unknown to many of the assembled lords. He moved to the center of the hall, where a raised platform had been erected, and turned to face an audience that would decide not just his fate, but the future of the realm. Robb spoke first, his voice carrying the authority of the king in the north as he addressed his bannermen. "Lords of the North and Riverlands, I have called you here today to witness a revelation that changes everything we thought we knew about this war, about justice, and about the rightful rule of the 7 kingdoms. A murmur ran through the assembled lords, confusion and anticipation mixing in the crowd as they tried to understand what their young king was about to reveal. For 15 years, Robb continued, his eyes finding Jon's across the distance, my family has kept a secret that was necessary to protect an innocent life, but which now must be revealed to serve the greater good of the realm. Jon stepped forward, his voice clear and strong as he addressed the lords for the first time, not as a bastard seeking acceptance, but as a prince claiming his birthright. My lords, he began, you have known me as Jon Snow, bastard son of Eddard Stark. That was a lie, a necessary lie told to protect me from those who would have killed me for the crime of my birth. Today I stand before you as Aegon Targaryen, son of Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, and Lady Lyanna Stark, rightful heir to the Iron Throne. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the crackle of torches and the distant sound of wind through the castle walls. Then, like a dam breaking, voices erupted throughout the hall, some in shock, others in anger, a few in what might have been hope. "Prove it!" shouted Lord Karstark, his face flushed with disbelief. "Anyone can claim to be a prince. Where's your evidence?" Howland Reed stepped forward, his small frame somehow commanding attention, despite the chaos around him. "I was there," he said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "I was with Lord Eddard at the Tower of Joy when we found Prince Rhaegar's Kingsguard standing watch over the woman they loved. I was there when we climbed those stairs and found Lyanna Stark dying in a bed of blood, with her newborn son in her arms." The hall grew quieter as Reed's testimony continued, his calm voice recounting details that only someone present could have known. She made her brother promise to protect the child, to keep him safe from Robert's wrath. Ned Stark kept that promise, at the cost of his honor and ultimately his freedom. The boy you've known as Jon Snow is the prince she died to save. Jon lifted Rhaegar's harp, the silver catching the light as he began to play. The melody that emerged was hauntingly beautiful, filled with longing and loss, and several of the older lords who had known Rhaegar recognized it immediately. "That's the song," Lord Mallister whispered, his face pale with recognition. "The song Prince Rhaegar played at Harrenhal when he crowned Lady Lyanna Queen of Love and Beauty. How could a bastard know that song unless—" Lord Blackwood's voice trailed off as the implications struck him. Catelyn stepped forward, her voice steady as she addressed the lords who had known her since childhood. "I know what you're thinking, that this is some elaborate deception, some desperate gambit to turn the tide of war. But I stand before you today to confess my own part in this deception and to tell you why it was necessary." She described the early years, the careful education, the gradual realization that the child she had resented was actually her nephew by marriage. "I have spent 15 years learning to love Aegon Targaryen, even when he wore the name Jon Snow. I have seen him grow into a man worthy of the crown he was born to claim, honorable like his Uncle Ned, but with the strength to do what honor sometimes cannot." The reactions among the lords were mixed but telling. The younger men, those who had grown up hearing stories of the Mad King's cruelties but had never lived under Targaryen rule, seemed more willing to consider the possibility. The older lords, those who remembered Aerys's reign and the wars that followed, were more skeptical. "Even if this is true," Lord Umber rumbled, his massive frame imposing even while seated, "what makes you think we'd follow another Targaryen? The last one tried to burn us all." Jon's response came without hesitation, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had found his true purpose. Because I am not Aerys Targaryen. I am not even Rhaegar Targaryen, whatever his virtues or flaws. I am the son of Lyanna Stark, raised by Eddard Stark, taught northern values and northern honor. I have seen war and injustice, have lived as the lowest among you, and I know what the realm needs. Not the mad dreams of a broken king, but the steady hand of someone who understands both justice and mercy. He paused, looking out over the assembled lords with the confidence that had grown in him since learning his true identity. I offer pardons to all who served Robert's regime honestly, amnesty to those who kneel and serve the realm rather than their own ambition. I do not seek the throne for glory or power, but because the realm is bleeding and needs a king who can heal it. Lord Manderley was the first to kneel, his massive bulk lowering to the floor as he spoke words that would be remembered by history. House Manderley has always served the rightful king. If you are truly Aegon Targaryen, then you have our swords and our ships. Others followed, some immediately, others after long moments of consideration. But it was Robb's gesture that truly sealed the moment. The young wolf stepped down from his throne, moved to where Jon stood, and knelt before his brother, his half-uncle technically, though such distinctions seemed meaningless in that moment. I, Robb Stark, king in the north, acknowledge Aegon Targaryen as the rightful king of the Seven Kingdoms, Robb declared, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. The north will stand with the dragons once more, as we did when they united the realm in justice rather than divided it in madness. The gesture broke the last resistance among the northern lords. If the king in the north acknowledged this claimant, if the son of Honorable Ned Stark was willing to kneel, then perhaps this Targaryen truly was different from his predecessors. As the ceremony of acknowledgement continued, a commotion near the hall's entrance drew attention. A travel-stained messenger had arrived, bearing news from across the narrow sea that would change the calculations of every lord present. "Your Grace," the messenger said, kneeling before Jon with the automatic deference now due to an acknowledged king. "Word from Essos. The Targaryen girl, Daenerys, has hatched dragons. Real dragons, alive and growing. She calls herself the Mother of Dragons, and has taken the city of Meereen with fire and blood." The silence that followed this announcement was different from the earlier quiet, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. Jon felt his world shift again as he processed the implications. He was not the last dragon, after all. Somewhere across the narrow sea, his aunt was building her own power, commanding the creatures of legend that had once made his family the masters of the known world. 3 dragons, the messenger continued, and growing larger each day. The stories say they're the first dragons seen in the world for over a century. Jon looked out over the assembled lords, seeing in their faces the same mixture of wonder and fear that he felt in his own heart. Daenerys Targaryen changed everything. She was potential ally or rival, family or enemy, depending on choices that had yet to be made. "Then we have much work to do," Jon said finally, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the news. "A broken realm to heal, enemies to defeat, and family to reunite. But for the first time in 15 years, the dragons have returned to the world. Let our enemies tremble, and let those who serve justice take heart." As the formal ceremonies concluded and the lords began to plan for the wars to come, Jon felt the weight of his true destiny settling fully onto his shoulders. He was no longer hiding, no longer pretending, no longer waiting for his real life to begin. Aegon Targaryen had returned to claim his birthright, and the Seven Kingdoms would never be the same. The Game of Thrones had been fundamentally altered by the revelation of the hidden prince, but it was far from over. Now it would be played with dragons in the sky and prophecy in the air, with the promise of magic returning to a world that had almost forgotten how to believe in wonders. The War of Five Kings was about to become something far larger and more dangerous than anyone had imagined, a war that would determine not just who sat the Iron Throne, but what kind of realm would survive to see the spring. Chapter 12. Ice and fire united. The Iron Throne had never felt comfortable beneath any king who sat upon it. But as Aegon Targaryen, sixth of his name, first of his line to rule with both northern honor and dragonfire, settled into the seat that his ancestors had forged from conquest and held through 3 centuries of rule, he found a strange sense of rightness in its ancient embrace. The 1,000 swords of Aegon, the conqueror's enemies, had been reforged one final time, not in metal but in purpose, shaped by the choices of a woman who had discovered a letter and decided to love rather than hate. The coronation had taken place on the first day of the new year, with Catelyn Stark placing the crown of Aegon the Conqueror upon the head of the young man she had spent 15 years learning to call son. No ceremony in the history of the 7 kingdoms had ever carried such weight of revelation and redemption, watched by lords who had seen their world remade by truth rather than conquest. Do you solemnly swear to rule justly, to defend the innocent, to uphold the laws of gods and men, and to protect the realm from all enemies, both foreign and domestic? Catelyn had asked, her voice carrying across the great sept of Baelor to lords and common folk alike who had come to witness the restoration they never thought they would see. "I do so swear," Jon had replied, but as the crown settled onto his brow, he added words that no king before him had ever spoken. "I swear by the old gods and the new, by ice and fire, by the memory of all who died to bring me to this moment, that I will rule not as conqueror, but as protector, not as master, but as servant of the realm's true needs." The war with the Lannisters had ended, not in the bloodbath that many expected, but through a combination of strategic brilliance and political necessity that had left even Tywin Lannister grudgingly impressed. Rather than storm King's Landing with fire and sword, Jon had offered terms that split his enemies and rallied the uncommitted, pardon for those who bent the knee, exile rather than execution for the leadership, and compensation for those who had suffered under the regime of false kings. "You fight like a Stark, but rule like a Targaryen," Tyrion Lannister had observed during the negotiations that ended the war, his wine cup raised in ironic salute. "Your father would be proud, both of them." The small lion had negotiated his family's surrender with the wit and pragmatism that had kept him alive through decades of court intrigue, recognizing that resistance meant destruction, while accommodation might mean survival. Cersei's exile to Casterly Rock was a mercy that surprised many, but Jon had learned from Catelyn that ruling meant sometimes choosing forgiveness over justice when the realm's peace demanded it. Now, 6 months after his coronation, King Aegon sat in the Hand's Tower with the woman who had become not just his advisor, but the architect of the new kingdom they were building together. Catelyn had accepted the position of Hand with the same fierce determination she had once brought to protecting his secret, understanding that the skills that had hidden a prince could also guide a king. "The marriage proposals," Catelyn said, setting down a stack of letters that had arrived with the morning's ravens. "House Tyrell offers Margaery with the full support of the Reach. House Martell suggests one of Prince Oberyn's daughters, along with an alliance that would secure Dorne permanently. And there's this." She held up a letter sealed with the 3-headed dragon of House Targaryen, but not Jon's own seal. The parchment bore the mark of Daenerys Targaryen, the Dragon Queen who had taken Meereen and whose reputation for justice and dragons had spread even to Westeros. "My aunt writes again," Jon said, though the word aunt still felt strange when applied to a woman only a few years older than himself. "What does she say this time?" "She acknowledges your claim and your right to the Iron Throne," Catelyn replied, scanning the elegant script that had crossed the narrow sea. "But she also makes it clear that she considers herself your equal, not your subject. She suggests a meeting, when her business in Slaver's Bay is concluded, to discuss the future of House Targaryen and the realm's need for dragons." Jon stood and moved to the window, looking out over King's Landing, where the people went about their daily lives under a king they were still learning to trust. In the distance, the Red Keep's walls stood strong against the autumn sky, but his eyes were drawn north, toward the lands beyond the neck where winter was coming with more than cold in its embrace. "I dreamed of her last night," he said quietly. "Daenerys. We were standing together on the walls of Winterfell, watching something approach from the north, something that made even dragons afraid." "The others," Catelyn said, recognizing the prophetic quality in his voice that had become more pronounced since accepting his crown. "You've been having those dreams more frequently." "Every night now. I see armies of the dead, led by creatures of ice and shadow. I see the wall falling, winter that never ends, darkness that swallows everything." Jon turned back to her, his grey eyes holding depths of understanding that sometimes made her forget he was still so young. "The war we just fought, all the politics and crowns and thrones, it's all meaningless compared to what's coming." Catelyn studied the young king who had grown from the bastard boy she had once resented into a man worthy of his crown and his destiny. In the months since his coronation, Jon had proven himself not just as a ruler, but as a leader who understood that true strength came from uniting rather than conquering. "Then we prepare," she said simply. "We unite the realm not just under your rule, but around the understanding that survival depends on standing together. We make alliances, we gather armies, we ensure that when the real war comes, we're ready to fight it." "And Daenerys? Your aunt has dragons, Jon. When the dead march south, fire may be the only thing that can stop them. Personal feelings aside, the realm needs those dragons, and she needs allies who understand what's at stake." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the chamber door. Ser Jorah Mormont entered, his weathered face bearing the satisfaction of a knight who had found his way back to honourable service after years of exile and disgrace. "Your Grace, my lady," he said, bowing to each in turn. "Word from the wall. Lord Commander Stark wishes to report that the ranging parties have encountered unusual activity beyond the barrier. Dead things walking, villages found empty but not abandoned. He requests permission to increase the Watchers' numbers and strengthen the wall's defences." Jon felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Ned had taken the Black as planned, had risen to leadership of the Night's Watch through the same honour and competence that had made him a great lord. Having him at the wall was both a comfort and a reminder of everything their family had sacrificed to reach this moment. "Send word that he has whatever he needs," Jon commanded. "Men, supplies, weapons, whatever the Watch requires to hold the wall. And tell him—" He paused, considering his words carefully. "Tell him that his son understands what he's guarding against, and that the realm will stand with him when the time comes." As evening fell over King's Landing, Jon found himself in the royal chambers, with their walls covered in maps of the 7 kingdoms and the lands beyond. Red pins marked the positions of loyal armies. Blue ones showed potential threats, while black pins marked the reports of strange happenings that grew more frequent with each passing week. "You know," Catelyn said, as she joined him in studying the great map, 15 years ago, when I found that letter and made the choice to protect you rather than hate you, I never imagined it would lead to this. "Do you regret it?" Jon asked, though he was not sure he wanted to hear the answer. "How could I regret something that gave the realm a king who cares more about protecting his people than glorifying himself?" Catelyn replied, her voice soft with affection that had grown from duty to love over the long years of conspiracy and care. "You've become everything Ned hoped you would be, and more than even I dared dream." The conversation turned to plans for the future, alliances to be forged, defenses to be built, the delicate work of preparing a kingdom for a war its people couldn't yet imagine. But underneath the political necessities ran deeper currents, the bonds of family that had survived deception and distance, the promises kept and prices paid, the understanding that love could be stronger than law when the stakes demanded it. "When you have children," Catelyn said, as they prepared to retire for the night, "what will you name the first boy?" Jon smiled, understanding the question behind the question. "Eddard," he said without hesitation. "Eddard Targaryen, after the man who raised me to understand that honor and duty are not burdens but privileges. Let the realm remember that dragons can learn wolf's songs, and that the best kings are those who remember they were once merely men." That night, as King Aegon slept in the chambers that had housed his ancestors, he dreamed one final time of the woman who had changed everything. In his vision, Catelyn stood in Winterfell's Godswood, holding a letter in her hands, while a young boy played at her feet, a boy with dark hair and eyes that held both ice and fire. "You found him," the dream Catelyn said, her voice carrying across years and distance. "You found the prince we hid, and you made him a king worth following." "We all found him," came the reply, from a voice Jon recognized as his own, though older and marked by years of rule. "You began it with a choice to love rather than hate. Everyone else just followed where you led." When he woke, Jon understood that the dream was not prophecy, but memory, the story of how a woman's discovery of a blood-stained letter had led to the salvation of a kingdom. The Game of Thrones would continue, new threats would emerge, and greater challenges lay ahead. But the foundation had been laid by love disguised as duty, truth disguised as lies, and a mother's heart that had learned to see a son where others saw only shame. Outside the royal chambers, the Iron Throne waited in its hall, ready for another day of the careful work of ruling. The dragons had returned to Westeros, not through conquest but through revelation, and the realm was stronger for the truth that had finally been told. In the end, that was Catelyn Stark's greatest victory. Not just that she had saved a prince, but that she had helped him become a king worthy of the crown she had spent 15 years teaching him to wear. The song of ice and fire had finally been sung, and its melody was love triumphant over fear, truth victorious over lies, and family bonds stronger than any throne. The hidden prince had become a beloved king, and the woman who had made it possible could rest, knowing that her choices, all of them, even the hardest ones, had served the realm's truest needs. The Game of Thrones would never end, but for the first time in generations, it would be played by those who understood that winning meant protecting rather than conquering, serving rather than ruling. The dragons were home at last, and winter could come when it would. King Aegon and Queen Mother Catelyn would be ready,